Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I was on nights again, sitting alone in the comms trailer with a space heater humming behind me and a mug of burnt coffee going cold on the desk. It was late October, windy enough that the walls creaked every few minutes. The desert outside was pitch black except for the runway lights in the distance and the faint glow from Groom Lake's main buildings. My job was simple: monitor assigned radio bands, flag any unusual traffic, and keep the logs clean. 90% of the shift was dull. Static, encrypted bursts from aircraft, occasional check-ins from ground crews, nothing dramatic. Around 1:40 a.m., I was scanning through the mid-band frequencies when something hit my headset hard, like a jolt of noise. Just a short burst of audio, less than a second, but sharp enough that I took the headphones off instinctively. I rewound and played it again. It wasn't like any call sign, not even the scrambled ones the test flights used. It sounded layered, like 2 or 3 voices speaking at once, but not in unison. More like overlapping syllables, none of them forming actual words. There was distortion too, but not the usual kind. This had a mechanical edge, like metal bending underwater. I listened again. Same strange jumble. I checked the log to see what timestamp the system assigned. Nothing. The software had flagged audio anomaly with no source ID. It hadn't even labeled the frequency. I tried to isolate it manually, pulling up surrounding time blocks and inspecting the waveform. The burst was there, just this dense spike that didn't look like any transmission I'd seen in my years doing this. I saved it as a clip so I could attach it to a report later. When the window popped up for the file name, I noticed something off. The preview waveform showed flat silence. I thought it was just the thumbnail failing to render, so I reopened the file. It wouldn't play. Just an error saying the audio was corrupted. I tried again, exporting it in 2 different formats. Same thing, corrupted. The original recording on the main system still existed, so I hit play on that file. Silence. Not even static. Just a dead, empty track. I checked the timestamp again. The system now showed no activity for that minute. I rubbed my eyes, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing, but the spike had been right there a few minutes before. I knew I hadn't hallucinated the sound hit hard enough to make me jump. While I was rechecking everything, I heard something unusual outside. A faint tapping on the trailer wall. Not knocking. More like something brushing against the metal siding. The wind was blowing from the south, but the sound came from the opposite side. I looked at the small window, but it was too dark to see anything. The tapping stopped after a few seconds. I put my headset back on and resumed scanning, trying to focus on work. A few normal transmissions came through. Routine stuff. For a moment, I convinced myself the earlier burst had been some kind of glitch. Then, around 2:15, another spike hit the system. This time I caught it visually before listening. A tight block of dense waveform that appeared for a split second and then flattened out on its own, like the file was rewriting itself. I opened the buffer to play it back. The audio was there, distorted, layered, maybe even faster than the first one. It wasn't quite voices, but it wasn't just noise either. The closest thing I can compare it to is people whispering through a fan, but multiple layers at different speeds. It lasted maybe half a second. Before I could save it, the waveform blinked and disappeared. The entire track rewrote itself to silence. I didn't touch anything. I just sat there staring at the screen. The heater behind me clicked off and the sudden quiet made the whole trailer feel colder. I switched to an external recorder I kept for redundancy, a cheap little handheld unit. I set it next to the monitor and waited, listening through the speakers instead of the headset. Around 2:40, something came through again. Not the same burst. This one was softer, like the layers were fading in and out. A ripple of overlapping tones, rising and falling, almost patterned but not rhythmic. I pressed record on the handheld and captured several seconds before the transmission faded. I stopped the recorder, rewound it, and hit play. All I heard was wind and the faint sound of me shifting in my chair. I checked the file properties. The recorder had saved it, but the waveform looked nearly flat. No sign of the layered tones I'd heard in the room. I played the raw desktop feed again. Gone. I sat there with my hands pressed against my forehead, trying to figure out what I was doing wrong. I'd been doing this job long enough to know the difference between interference and whatever this was. Around 3:10, the lights in the trailer flickered. Not off, just dim for a second. The radio screen stayed on, but the air felt strange, like the pressure changed. My ears popped the way they do when you're driving up a mountain. The heater turned back on by itself, even though it usually needed a manual reset after a power dip. Then the boards lit again. Another alert. Unclassified audio detected. Source unknown. A burst flashed in the waveform window but didn't stay long enough for me to hit play. Just a flicker of data and then nothing. I stood up, mostly because sitting still felt impossible. I cracked open the trailer door and stepped outside. The wind had died completely. The sky was dark, cloudy, no stars showing. The desert felt muffled, like all the usual ambient noise had been cut out. I walked a few steps from the door and looked toward the test hangars. Nothing unusual. Lights glowing, the same as always. But the air still felt heavy, thick. I went back inside. No new alerts, no audio. Everything looked normal again. At 6 a.m., the day shift arrived. My replacement, a guy named Rains. Solid worker, usually easy to talk to. I explained what had happened, but he just stared at the screen and said the logs didn't reflect any anomalies. I told him they had earlier, but he shrugged. If it's not in the system, it didn't happen. I went home tired, replaying the sounds in my head. I tried to describe them to myself, but they were already hard to pin down, like my memory was smoothing them out. I kept thinking about the layered quality, how none of the tones matched, how they all blended into something that didn't feel like it came from any aircraft. Later that afternoon, before going to bed, I checked the handheld recorder again. The files were still there, still empty. But when I put on headphones and turned the volume all the way up, I thought, just for a moment, that I heard something under the wind. Not whispering, exactly. More like the echo of syllables someone had erased too quickly. By the next shift, nothing else happened. The frequencies stayed clean. No distortions, no bursts, no corrupted files. But the logs from that night never came back. Every entry I made between 1:30 and 4 a.m. was gone, replaced with routine system checks I didn't run. My supervisor said it was a syncing issue. I didn't argue. I knew what I'd heard. I woke up around 3 a.m. because my sleeping pad was vibrating. It wasn't shaking hard, just this steady, low hum coming up through the ground, like someone had parked a generator underground. At first, I thought it was my imagination. I'd hiked most of the day before, set up camp just after sunset, and crashed hard. I was maybe 10 miles from the closest paved road, out in a stretch of desert that was mostly empty except for scrub and old fence posts. I knew I was somewhere south of the restricted boundary, but still far enough away that nobody cared. The hum kept going, though, slow, even, almost rhythmic. I felt it more than heard it. I unzipped my tent halfway and poked my head out. The air was cold enough to make me cough. No wind, no insects, just this strange vibration under me. I sat up fully and crawled out. My boots were freezing. I pulled on a jacket and looked around. The desert was dark, but not pitch black. There was a half moon somewhere behind thin clouds, just enough light to see the outline of my pack and the rocks nearby. The hum got slightly louder when I stepped away from the tent, like the ground was a speaker and I'd walked closer to the source. I turned in a slow circle, trying to figure out what direction it was coming from. It didn't seem to have one. It felt like it was everywhere at once. That's when I noticed the lights. 3 pale dots in a straight horizontal line, high up but not space high. They looked like they were just hovering above the desert, completely still. No blinking, no movement, no sound. For a good 30 seconds, I didn't even think about grabbing my phone. I just stared. The lights weren't bright like aircraft lights. They were dim, almost washed out, like distant stars, except they were too close and too perfectly spaced. I finally thought to check the time, 3:04 a.m., and then I held up my phone and hit record. The screen showed nothing, just black, like the camera couldn't see the lights at all. I tried zooming, tried tapping to focus, still black. The humming under my feet pulsed once, harder than before. Not enough to knock me over, just enough that my knees tensed automatically. The lights didn't react, they didn't shake or flicker, they just hung there. I kept watching, trying to make sense of them. I'd camped a lot, all over Nevada and Utah, and I'd seen aircraft test flights before. Drones, helicopters, weird military stuff. Nothing behaved like this. A plane would have had sound, a helicopter would have had movement, even drones make a buzzing that echoes. These lights were silent. Around the 7 or 8 minute mark, I started feeling uneasy. Not scared exactly, just aware of how alone I was. No one around for miles, nothing but cold air and silent desert. My phone recording was still running. I held it up again and swung it toward the lights. The screen stayed black except for the timestamp. The hum softened a little. Then it faded entirely, like someone turning down a volume knob. The lights stayed still. For a second, I thought they were fading too, but then I realized they weren't. They were moving. Straight up. Not fast at first, but in this weird way where I couldn't tell when they started accelerating. One moment, they were floating above the desert. The next, they were shooting toward the sky like someone had yanked them into space. No trail, no burst, no arc. Just a clean upward line until the 3 dots vanished into the dark. I stood there long after they disappeared, waiting for another hum or flash or anything. The desert went back to being normal. A little wind picked up, brushing against the tent. I checked the ground with my boot a few times. No more vibration. When I got back inside the tent, I replayed the video. It was just darkness and the sound of wind hitting the microphone. No lights, no hum, not even my breathing. I stayed awake until dawn, halfway expecting the hum to come back. The sun came up pale and cold, lighting the rocks and tent poles like nothing had happened. I packed slowly, checking the sky every few minutes. Nothing there but a couple thin clouds drifting east. On my hike back toward the road, I kept thinking about how long the lights had hovered. Nearly 10 minutes. Nothing mechanical I knew could stay that still without drifting. Even satellites move across the sky. The ground didn't hum again the whole walk out. I told myself maybe it was some kind of underground test. Maybe the lights were flares I misjudged. Maybe exhaustion made everything seem stranger. But I'd been awake, fully awake, by the time the hum faded. And those 3 lights had moved straight up, not sideways or out of sight behind a ridge. When I reached my car, I checked the video one more time before driving out. Still nothing but black. The rest of the day felt off. The desert looked the same, but it felt heavier, like I'd camped too close to something I wasn't supposed to notice. The phone recording never changed. No matter how many times I replayed it, it was just wind and darkness, like the camera hadn't been pointing at anything at all. Image, I was only supposed to be at Area 51 for 2 weeks, while my unit back at Nellis worked through a staffing shuffle. Temporary assignment, nothing special. I'd been an Air Force mechanic for 8 years, mostly F-16s, sometimes the odd support craft. I wasn't cleared for the interesting stuff, and I wasn't expecting to be. They told me I'd be doing routine inspections, tooling checks, and whatever else they didn't feel like handing to the permanent crews. The first weird thing happened on my 3rd night shift. Cold, dry wind outside, one of those desert nights where sound carries too far. I was doing a parts run between Hangar B and the machine shop when I noticed a door cracked open in Hangar D. I hadn't seen anyone go in, and the shift schedule didn't list any repairs happening there. I figured someone forgot to lock up, so I stepped inside to check. The lights were low, just the security strips along the floor. For a second, I thought the place was empty. Then my eyes adjusted and I saw a shape at the far end of the hangar. A jet, sort of. At least it had the general silhouette of one. But the surface, it didn't look right. There were no seams, no rivets, no access panels. Just one continuous surface from nose to tail, like someone had poured the whole thing out of molten metal and let it cool. I walked closer, slow, trying to place the model. The wings blended into the fuselage without any edges. No serial numbers or stencils. No intake grates. Nothing. I stopped about 3 feet from it. The metal looked matte from a distance, but had this strange depth to it up close, like it wasn't totally opaque. I reached out and touched it with my fingertips. It was warm. Not hot like it had been running, just a little warmer than the air, like a person's skin. I jerked my hand back without meaning to. Machines don't stay warm in a cold hangar unless someone powered them recently. But there weren't any crew around, no tool carts, no signs of a maintenance job in progress. I didn't hear footsteps either, but I suddenly had that feeling you get when someone's watching you, when the air seems to shift behind you even though nothing moves. I turned around. Nobody. The hangar was silent, except for faint buzzing from the overhead lights. I stood there another minute, staring at the thing, trying to find anything familiar on it. Panel lines, removable components, fasteners. Nothing. Its nose cone didn't even have the usual access points. The canopy, if that's what it was perfectly smooth too, no hinges or frame. My badge shouldn't have opened that hangar door. That thought hit me as I backed away. Hangar D was restricted to project crews I'd never met. The fact that the door opened for me made even less sense. I left as quietly as I could and didn't log anything. I barely slept the next morning. When I came back on shift the next night, I tried convincing myself I'd misread the situation. Lack of sleep, weird lighting, some experimental airframe I wasn't supposed to recognize. Stuff like that lurked around bases all the time. But halfway through the shift, I walked past Hangar D again. The door was closed. Locked. No lights inside. I scanned my badge just to see. Red light. Access denied. My stomach dropped. I flagged down a staff sergeant named Hale who'd been there longer than almost anyone. Was there work scheduled in Hangar D last night? I asked him. He frowned. Hangar D's been empty for a week. That's not what I saw. Well, that's what the sheet says. I asked who else was assigned there. Project teams only, not us. That was supposed to be the end of it. But the way he said it felt off, like he wanted the conversation over before it even started. I went through the rest of the night feeling wired, checking shadows twice, jumping at sounds I normally ignored. Even the routine maintenance tasks felt strange. Every jet I inspected suddenly seemed too normal, too familiar, like I'd been working with toys and stumbled across the real thing by accident. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about the warmth of the metal under my fingers. On my final night before rotating out, I gave in and walked toward Hangar D again, telling myself I just wanted to prove nothing unusual was there. The compound was quiet, only the wind rattling a loose cable somewhere. When I reached the door, Hale was standing outside it. He wasn't smoking or checking a clipboard, just standing there like he'd been waiting. "You lost?" he asked. "No," I said. "Just headed to the machine shop." "That's the other direction." "Oh, right." He didn't move aside, didn't look impatient. But there was something in his expression that told me I wasn't supposed to be near that door. Not tonight. Not any night. I nodded and walked off. When I reached the shop, I turned around. Hale was still at the door, watching me. That was the last night of my assignment. By the time I returned to Nellis, I convinced myself the jet was some prototype I wasn't cleared to see, and someone had screwed up a lockout tag or a badge restriction. Still, a week later, I emailed a guy I knew in logistics on the Groom Lake side. I asked if he could send me the updated inventory sheets for Hangar D. I made up a reason about misplaced parts. He sent them. Hangar D was marked vacant. No aircraft, no special projects, nothing. I stared at the file so long my laptop dimmed and went dark. I started wondering if I really had gone into the wrong building that first night. Maybe I mixed up the labels in the dark. Maybe I imagined the warmth, the smooth surface, the lack of seams. 2 days later, Hale emailed me. No subject line, no signature, just one sentence. "You didn't walk into the wrong building. You just don't need to walk into it again." That was the only acknowledgement I ever got. The next week, the email was gone from my inbox. Deleted. Not archived. Gone. I didn't delete it. I didn't ask questions. I didn't try to go back, and I never touched metal like that ever again. I was 3 days into a contract job when it started getting weird. I'm an independent security tech. Mostly warehouses, schools, the occasional casino. A guy named Brent from a defense subcontractor called me about upgrading camera systems at a remote testing facility outside of Rachel, Nevada. He never said Area 51. He didn't have to. If you've ever driven that stretch of desert, you know exactly where you are. The facility wasn't the main base people think of. It was a smaller compound about 40 minutes off the highway, down a road that looked like it hadn't been graded in years. Chain link fencing, 2 squat hangars, 1 long concrete building with no windows, and a handful of light poles that hummed constantly. That was it. It was late August, hot even after sunset. The kind of dry heat that made your lips crack without you realizing it. The job sounded simple. Replace outdated analog cameras with digital IP systems, rerun some cable, set up a new internal monitoring station. Brent introduced me to the on-site supervisor, a guy named Victor Hale. Early 40s, quiet, crew cut, didn't waste words. There were maybe 8 other personnel rotating in and out, but it always felt half empty. Victor kept saying one thing over and over: if you see something odd on a feed, it's probably a test artifact. I didn't ask what that meant. The first 2 days were normal. I mounted cameras along the perimeter fence and inside Hangar 1. Hangar 2 was supposedly inactive. Storage only, Victor told me. You won't need to go in there. I still ran a line for it. That was part of the contract. The monitoring station was set up in a small control room attached to the concrete building. No windows. Just 2 desks, racks of equipment, and a wall of screens. I configured everything myself, so I knew the system inside out. There was no wireless trickery, hard lines, redundant storage, local backup. On the 3rd night, I stayed late to finish calibrating the interior cameras. It was around 11:30 p.m. The sky outside had that washed-out look from the security lights reflecting off dust in the air. No moon, no clouds, just flat black beyond the fence. Victor had left around 9. A younger guy named Eli was technically on overnight duty, but he mostly sat in his truck near the gate. I was alone in the control room. That's when I noticed the first glitch. It was camera H203, mounted high inside Hangar 2, angled toward the far wall. The hangar lights were off, but there was enough spill from outside to see shapes inside. Crates, covered equipment, a scissor lift parked near the center. The feed didn't go to static. It didn't cut out. Something moved across the frame. At first, I thought it was compression lag, but this wasn't a choppy blur. It looked like something tall passing directly in front of the lens, close enough to block most of the view for maybe half a second. Then it was gone. The image snapped back to normal. I leaned closer to the monitor. The hangar was still dark, still empty. I scrubbed back the footage 10 seconds. Nothing. I went back another minute. Still nothing. I checked the timestamp. It hadn't skipped. No dropped frames. I watched it live for another 5 minutes. No movement. I told myself it was a calibration hiccup. The system was new. Firmware glitches happened. But something bothered me. The way it moved. It wasn't quick like a bird or debris. It was smooth, vertical, like someone walking very close to the camera. I called Victor. He answered on the second ring, sounding wide awake. "There shouldn't be anyone in Hangar 2, I said. "Correct," he replied. "I just saw movement on the feed." Silence. Not confused silence. More like waiting. "Probably a lighting shift," he said. "Thermal expansion. Metal surfaces can cause distortion." That wasn't distortion. Make a note of it in the log. That was it. No follow-up questions. I got up and walked outside. The air felt thicker than it had earlier. No wind, just that low electrical hum from the light poles. Hangar 2 was about 60 yards from the control building. The big sliding doors were closed and padlocked. I walked around the side. No vehicles. No footprints in the dust, except mine from earlier that afternoon. I stood there longer than I needed to. There was no sound from inside, no machinery, nothing shifting. I went back in. When I checked the feed again, everything looked normal. I stayed until 1 a.m., half expecting it to happen again. It didn't. The next day, I pulled the archived footage from the server to review it properly. The glitch wasn't there. Not erased, not corrupted. It just wasn't there. The timeline showed continuous footage. No interruptions, no darkened frames, no shadow crossing the lens. I thought maybe I'd imagined it. Fatigue does weird things in windowless rooms. But that night, it happened again. Different camera. H201 this time. Mounted near the hangar doors, angled inward. I saw it out of the corner of my eye. A shape interrupting the light pattern on the floor. Taller than the door frame behind it, but that could have been perspective. As it moved slowly. Too slowly to be a glitch. I snapped my eyes fully to the screen. It was already gone. I immediately saved a manual clip. When I replayed it, the interruption wasn't there. I felt my stomach drop in a way I can't really explain. Not panic. More like that feeling when you realize something doesn't add up and there's no obvious fix. I went outside again. This time, I didn't walk straight to Hangar 2. I stopped halfway and just listened. Somewhere in the distance, I heard what sounded like a low metallic thud. Not loud, just enough to register. It didn't come again. I kept thinking about the height of that shape. It hadn't been bulky, more narrow, almost too narrow. Back inside, I checked system diagnostics. No packet loss, no dropped frames, no unauthorized access. The server log showed nothing unusual. Around midnight, Eli knocked on the control room door. "You good?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Has anyone been in Hangar 2 tonight?" He frowned. "Nobody's cleared for that." "Does it have motion sensors?" "Of course." "Any alerts?" He shook his head. He didn't ask why I was asking. After he left, I watched the feeds without blinking for nearly an hour. At 12:47 a.m., all 3 interior cameras in Hangar 2 flickered at the exact same time. Not off, not black, just a subtle dimming, like something passed between the lights and the floor. I leaned forward, the feeds stabilized. Then I noticed something else. The scissor lift in the center of the hangar looked off. It had been angled slightly toward the east wall earlier that evening. Now it was straight. I told myself I was misremembering. I pulled up footage from earlier that day. The archived clip showed the scissor lift straight, exactly as it was now. I sat back slowly, because I was sure, completely sure, that when I'd mounted H-203, the lift had been angled. I'd even adjusted the camera to avoid glare from its metal railing. I called Victor again. This time he didn't answer. Around 1:15 a.m., I heard it. Not through the cameras, through the wall. A dull, rhythmic sound, like something heavy shifting its weight on concrete. 3 steps, pause. 3 more. It stopped. I didn't move for a long time. Eventually, I grabbed my keys and locked up. The drive back to my motel in Alamo felt longer than usual. The highway was empty. My headlights barely touched the darkness ahead. The next morning, Victor met me at the gate. "You finished?" he asked. "Almost." He studied my face like he was checking for something. "I'm submitting the final configuration today," I said. "After that, it's yours." He nodded. I almost told him everything, about the shape, the flicker, the lift. Instead, I asked, "Has Hangar 2 always been storage?" He held my gaze for a few seconds too long. "It's currently storage," he said. That afternoon, I exported all the footage again before handing over the system. I checked the timestamps carefully. Every glitch I'd seen, gone. But in one archived clip from 12:47 a.m., during the brief dimming, I noticed something I hadn't caught live. For exactly 2 frames near the far wall, there was a vertical distortion. Not a shadow, not static, more like the air itself bending upward. It was subtle, easy to miss. If I hadn't slowed it down frame by frame, I wouldn't have seen it. I saved that clip to a personal drive. When I opened it later at home, it played clean. No distortion, just an empty hangar. I don't take contracts out there anymore. The equipment I installed is probably still running. Clean feeds, clear logs. If something stands in front of those cameras now, it doesn't seem to stay long enough to be recorded. I was coming up on hour 11 of a long-haul run when dispatch called and rerouted me toward a restricted checkpoint outside Groom Lake. I'd done a few government contracts before, mostly gear and sealed crates that I never opened, never asked about. This load wasn't any different. 2 long metal containers, no markings, bolted shut. The paperwork didn't even list a weight, just a clearance code and a destination. Southgate Holding Zone. Wait for escort. It was early morning, technically, but still pitch dark. Late winter, freezing wind cutting across the desert. The sky had that washed-out look it gets before sunrise, but the sun was nowhere near coming up. My wipers scraped frost every few minutes. The road felt empty in a way I couldn't explain, even though I knew people worked out there every night. When I reached the outer checkpoint, 2 guards waved me onto a gravel patch just off the access road. One of them, a guy named Riggs, older, tired-looking, barely glanced at me, told me to shut the engine and wait until they got clearance. "Clearance for what?" I asked. "Air traffic," he said, like that explained everything. It didn't. We weren't anywhere near a normal flight path. But I didn't push it. He walked back toward the small guard shack with another guy, Taurus, leaving me sitting in my cab with the heater running off the battery. There weren't any other trucks, no aircraft noise, nothing but wind sliding across the sand and the metal fence. The waiting dragged. 10 minutes, 20, no updates. Around the 30-minute mark, I stepped out to stretch my legs. My breath came out in white bursts. The air smelled like dust and static electricity. Off in the distance, the desert looked flat, like someone had ironed the whole landscape smooth. The frost on the gravel crunched under my boots. I was leaning against the truck when I noticed Riggs and Torres standing side by side outside the shack, not talking, not smoking, not doing anything, just staring straight ahead like they were waiting for some invisible cue. I followed their line of sight out across the desert. At first, I didn't see anything. The horizon just looked dim and empty. Then something edged into view near the tops of the low hills. A dark shape. Hard to tell how far away it was, because there were no lights on it and no sound. It drifted forward at a slow, steady pace. I thought maybe it was a drone. This base tested plenty of unmanned aircraft, but drones don't usually fly without signal lights, and they don't move like they're floating. The shape angled slightly as it came closer, and for a moment the silhouette made sense. A triangle. Not a perfect one, more like a flattened arrowhead. No visible engines, no markings. Just a solid black shape gliding about 100 feet above the desert floor. Completely silent. I looked back at the guards. Nothing. No reaction at all. They didn't raise radios, didn't track it with their eyes. They acted like this was the most normal thing in the world, and I was the weird one for noticing. The craft passed maybe 200 yards from us, low enough that I could have hit it with a flare gun if I'd had one. It didn't wobble or tilt. It didn't kick up dust. It just crossed the desert in a smooth line, made a gentle turn over a dry lake bed, and disappeared behind a ridge without speeding up or slowing down. I waited for the guards to say something. A joke, a warning, anything. Nothing. Eventually, Riggs turned and walked back into the shack. Torres followed, like the whole thing had been scheduled. My heart was beating harder than it should have been, considering nothing technically threatened me. It wasn't fear, exactly. More like my brain couldn't figure out what category to put the thing in. Plane? No. Helicopter? No. Balloon? No. It reminded me of watching a fish move underwater, kind of detached from the world around it. 5 minutes later, Riggs came back out and told me I was cleared to proceed to the next checkpoint. I opened my mouth to ask a question, but he beat me to it. Escorts waiting. Follow the markers. No stops. That was it. The rest of the delivery went fine. A different team unloaded the crates. No small talk. A guy with a clipboard signed the manifest and told me I could head back to Highway 375. I didn't see the triangular craft again. I slept a few hours in my cab at a truck stop in Ash Springs before driving home. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me. When I reached dispatch, I asked the coordinator, Mara, someone I'd worked with for years, if she'd heard anything about aircraft testing near my delivery point. She said there was nothing on the logs. According to her, the airspace over the holding zone had been quiet all night. I mentioned the triangular craft, the route it took, how low it was. Nothing was scheduled, she repeated. If something was in your line of sight, it wasn't recorded. I asked if maybe the guards could confirm it. Guards don't log test activity, she said. They only track clearance levels. If they didn't say anything, there was nothing to say. Later that afternoon, I called the number on the paperwork, the one listed for reporting equipment damage or incidents. A man answered, didn't give a name, listened as I described what I saw, then paused. There were no flights at your location, he said flatly. I watched it pass my truck, I told him. Your manifest is complete, he replied. No irregularities noted. If that's all, I need this line clear. He hung up before I could say anything else. I spent the next couple hours replaying the sight in my head. The shape, the silence, the way the guards didn't react, the way it moved, like it didn't care about wind or physics or any of the things normal aircraft fight against. It wasn't a blimp, it wasn't a stealth jet, it wasn't a drone, and even if it had been one of those, someone on the base would have acknowledged it, but nobody would. A few days later, I took another run past the same region, completely different contract. This time, just standard supplies. When I asked one of the new guards, different crew, if they ever saw experimental aircraft on night shift, he just shook his head. Nothing flies over this zone, he said, too close to outer perimeter. I wanted to argue, to tell him what I saw, but he gave off the same vibe as the others. Even if he knew something, he wasn't going to say it to me. That night, parked behind a diner in Alamo, I watched the sky for a long time. Clear, cold, stars sharp enough to look fake. Nothing unusual. Not even a satellite passing overhead. The desert felt too quiet, though, like something had happened there and the world had folded itself back into place without leaving a mark. I still make runs through Nevada. I still haul sealed crates sometimes. But every time a guard tells me to wait for air traffic, I keep my eyes on the horizon, wondering if that same black triangle is going to drift by again, silent and slow, like it never needed permission to be there in the first place. I was halfway through a 12-hour overnight shift when the first motion alert went off. It was a cold, dry January night on the north side of the perimeter. I'd worked security around Groom Lake for almost 5 years by then, and the night shifts were usually quiet. Maybe the wind rattled a loose panel, maybe a coyote wandered close, maybe one of the older sensors had a bad connection. Nothing unusual. But this alert came from Sector 4, a stretch of fence that almost never gave us trouble. No wildlife, no dunes shifting against the posts, no blind spots. I acknowledged the alarm, pulled up the thermal feed, and saw nothing. Just the fence line and desert beyond it, all cold blues and grays. I logged it, cleared the alarm, and went back to paperwork. 5 minutes later, another alert. Same sector. Same spot, almost exactly. I opened the thermal again. Still nothing. This time I switched to the low-light camera. The image was grainy, but clear enough to see there wasn't anything near the fence. No shadows, no movement, not even blowing dust. I called it in to the rover unit, just one guy, Diaz, doing drive-arounds. He didn't sound thrilled about heading to the far side of the perimeter, but said he'd check it out. While he was on his way, a second alert popped up. Sector 4 again, but 20 yards to the east. Before I could even click it, a third alert triggered. Then a fourth. By the time Diaz radioed that he was pulling up to the east access road, the alarms were tripping one after another in a straight line, moving along the fence like something was pacing it from the inside. "Anything on thermal?" he asked. "Nothing," I said. "Feed's clean." He walked the fence. I could see his heat signature on thermal, bright orange against the dark. I told him where the last alert had come from. He swept his flashlight along the gravel and the bottom of the fence. Nothing there. "There's no wind," he said. "Nothing touching the wire." The alarms kept moving. Now they were triggering west of him, one at a time, evenly spaced, like something shifted direction. "You sure the system isn't bugging out?" Diaz asked. "I rebooted the panel," I said. "No change." For the next hour and a half, the alerts kept circling the perimeter. Slow, steady, never overlapping. Always spaced about 20 seconds apart, like whatever was setting them off moved at a walking pace. We had other guards, but the perimeter was big. Unless someone saw something on camera, nobody responded unless it became a real breach. And nothing ever showed up. I tried every camera angle we had. Thermal, low light, infrared overlays. All the same, empty desert, empty fence, empty sensor grid. But the alarms kept firing. Around 2 a.m., they hit Sector 7, which was closer to my building. I stepped outside with a handheld thermal scope. The cold hit me immediately. The wind had died completely. The only sound was the soft clicking of the scope's buttons as I scanned. The fence looked normal. The ground looked normal. No warm spots. No footprints. No animals. Nothing. But the sensor directly in front of me tripped anyway, flashing red on my handheld screen. I jumped a little. I'd been staring directly at that stretch of fence. Nothing had touched it. I looked at the scope again. Still nothing. I waited for another alert. It came from the next sensor down 10 seconds later. I tracked it as it moved, one sensor at a time, slowly circling away from me, heading west again. I went back inside, locked the door behind me, and spent the next few hours watching the pattern move around the entire perimeter. Every time I thought it had stopped, another alert flashed. Around 4 a.m., the movement slowed. The alerts came less frequently. Eventually, they stopped completely. I didn't relax, not right away. Diaz radioed in around 4:20, saying he was heading back to the main building to warm up. He sounded tired, not scared, just worn down. By 5:30, the shift lead, Owens, came in early. I told him everything. He didn't say much, just asked whether I'd logged it. I had. Every alert, every camera check, every reboot. He nodded like he already knew what I was going to say. "Don't mention it to anyone else," he said. "I'll review the logs." He took my chair and started reading through the list of alarms while I headed outside to meet Diaz. The sun was starting to come up, pale orange light barely touching the desert. The air was warming, but still cold enough to sting my cheeks. "I didn't see a thing all night," Diaz said. "I don't get it. Sensors don't do that without something moving." We walked the stretch of fence where the first alerts happened. The gravel showed a few tire tracks from his Rover and some scuffs from our boots. Then we saw the indentations. They were faint but visible in the sand, long, narrow impressions spaced evenly apart. Each one maybe a foot long, but only a couple inches wide. They weren't deep, just pressed into the top layer of sand like something had glided along instead of stepping. They ran parallel to the fence for about 40 yards, then stopped. No scatter, no drag marks, just ended. "You see this?" Diaz asked. Crouching down, he put his hand next to one of the indentations. Too narrow for a boot, too long for a paw. "Not a tire either," I said, and too evenly spaced. He ran his fingers over the sand. "Whatever made this wasn't heavy." We followed the line until it faded into flatter ground. No more marks, just normal sand. We checked the west side too. More of the same, in little broken stretches, narrow indentations spaced perfectly, always near the sensors that had tripped. By the time the sun rose fully, most of the traces were already disappearing under the light breeze. Nobody else on shift commented on them. Later that morning, Owens called me into the office. He handed me a printed report. It listed exactly 0 alarms for the night. "System errors," he said. "Already corrected." "That's not what happened," I said. He didn't answer. "And the marks in the sand." "Wind patterns," he said. "Happens out here." I stared at him. He didn't look angry or nervous, just resigned. After my shift ended, I walked out to my car feeling like I'd been up for days. The daytime crews were rolling in, yawning, holding coffee cups, talking about weekend plans. Everything looked normal. I checked the perimeter one last time before leaving. The sand was smooth again. Whatever we'd seen was gone. My final 2 nights on that assignment were uneventful. No alarms, no vibrations, no strange marks. The sensors behaved the way they were supposed to. But every time I glanced at the perimeter monitors, I found myself waiting. Not for something to appear on camera, but for the alarms to start moving again, one by one, around the fence like something quiet and patient was making its rounds. Nothing ever did. I was down in Utility Tunnel 3 just after midnight, lying on my stomach with half my upper body shoved into an access panel when I felt the vibration for the first time. It wasn't strong, just a low, steady tremor running through the concrete floor. At first, I thought it was a generator cycling up somewhere else in the network. That happened sometimes when power got rerouted during night tests. But this vibration didn't pulse. It didn't fade. It just stayed. A constant, even hum under my elbows and ribs. I'd been sent down there because a set of fiber lines in Section 3B kept dropping signal. Nothing exotic, just routine maintenance. Replace the connectors, reseal the junction box, run a diagnostic, call it good. The tunnels were quiet at night, which usually made the job easier. No foot traffic, no carts buzzing past, no pressure to hurry. But that night the air tasted like dust and metal, dry enough to sting my throat. I slid out of the panel and sat up. The vibration was stronger when I placed my palms flat on the floor. Not shaking, just humming, like some huge machine was running below me. Except nothing was supposed to be under Section 3B. The schematics for that part of the base were simple. Tunnel, conduit lines, emergency lights. Empty earth beneath it. I checked the wall to make sure it wasn't the conduits rattling. Everything was still. No loose clamps, no airflow. The whole tunnel was silent except for that faint hum coming through the concrete. I followed it a few steps. It didn't change. It didn't get louder or quieter. It was like the entire slab was the speaker for whatever was below. I pulled out my radio and called up to my supervisor, Mark. "You guys running any heavy equipment tonight?" I asked. "No." "Why?" he said. "Just checking. I'm getting some vibration down here." "From where?" "Everywhere. Hard to pin down." He paused. "Probably power cycling. We've had weird drain spikes." "Doesn't feel like power," I said. "Well, nothing's running in that sector. You okay to finish the job?" "Yeah," I said, even though I wasn't sure. I got back on my knees and reached into the panel again. The vibration made my tools buzz against the floor. I tightened a coupling and checked the line integrity. Everything looked normal. The cables didn't seem affected, but my hands wouldn't stop trembling, and I couldn't tell if it was the vibration or nerves. I kept working, trying to ignore the feeling that something much larger than me was moving somewhere far below, slow and deliberate. I'd heard stories from guys who'd worked other bases, rumors about underground testing floors, hidden elevators, all kinds of nonsense, but this wasn't like anything they'd described. This wasn't machinery starting and stopping. This was continuous, steady pressure. About 20 minutes later, the vibration changed pitch. Barely noticeable, but enough that I froze with one hand still buried in the wiring. The hum dipped lower, like whatever was below had shifted gears. I leaned forward and pressed my ear to the concrete. It felt almost warm against my skin. That wasn't possible. The tunnels stayed cold year-round. I jerked back and wiped the sweat from my forehead. The air felt tighter suddenly, like the tunnel was holding its breath. I stood up and took a few steps, trying to see if the vibration changed with distance. It didn't. No matter where I walked, the hum stayed exactly the same. Not louder, not softer, not directional, just present. I checked my watch. Almost 1 a.m. I wanted to be done, but when I turned back to the open panel, the lights overhead flickered once. Just once, barely a blink, but enough to make the tunnel look darker than it should have. I tightened the last connector, closed up the junction box, and ran a diagnostic on my handheld. The reading came back clean. Signal restored. Everything normal, except nothing felt normal. I started packing up my tools when the hum suddenly dipped again, deeper than before. This time, I felt it in my teeth. I swallowed hard and backed away from the wall. That's when I heard footsteps coming down the tunnel, just soft ones at first, then louder as Mark came into view, holding a flashlight even though the overhead lights were working. "You good down here?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, "just finishing up." He stepped into the section with me. The hum stopped, not gradually, not fading. It cut out instantly, like someone flipped a switch. Mark didn't react at all. He crouched next to the panel and checked the seal. "Looks fine," he said. "You fixed the drop?" "Yeah," he nodded and stood again. "Then you're done. Let's get upstairs." I didn't move at first. I was waiting for the vibration to come back, or for him to mention it, or for anything to acknowledge what had been happening. But the tunnel was silent. Just the faint buzz of the overhead lights and the sound of our breathing. "You don't hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" "The vibration from earlier." Mark sighed like he didn't want to have the conversation. "Power cycling. Happens all the time." This wasn't power. "There's nothing under this section," he said, not meeting my eye. "You've seen the schematics." I know what I felt. "Long night," he said. "Let's go." He walked back toward the access ladder. I followed, but slowly. Halfway up, I glanced back into the tunnel. It looked empty. Normal. Boring, even. But something about the concrete floor still bothered me. I couldn't shake the memory of that warmth against my ear. When we reached the surface level, I checked the system logs. No anomalies, no power fluctuations, no alerts. The timestamp for the moment the lights flickered wasn't even listed. I asked Mark if he saw anything weird in the logs earlier. "Nope," he said. "Everything's green." He shut the folder and gave me this tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Get some rest. You're overthinking it." I didn't argue. I clocked out, drove home, and lay awake for hours replaying the sensation in my head. The schematic said there was nothing underneath that tunnel. The logs said nothing happened. Mark said it was power cycling, but I knew what the concrete felt like. Steady, rhythmic, alive with something moving deep below where anything officially existed. And I knew it stopped the exact second he walked in. I saw the object about 40 minutes into a routine training flight. Late afternoon, winter sun dropping behind the mountains and throwing long shadows across the desert. The air was clear, smooth enough that the jet felt like it was gliding rather than cutting through anything. I was flying an F-15 out of Nellis, doing standard maneuvers near but not inside the restricted Groom Lake airspace. I'd flown that corridor hundreds of times. I knew every landmark, every checkpoint, every radio call. I was finishing a banking turn to the east when something caught my eye. Just a flicker of light at first, like a reflection off metal. At that altitude, reflections usually meant another aircraft, but nothing was supposed to be near me. The sky around me was clean. ATC had me alone in the block. I eased off the turn and leveled for a second. The reflection came again, this time clearer. Something metallic, maybe 100 yards off my right wing, matching my speed perfectly. I glanced at the HUD. Airspeed steady, no turbulence, everything normal. But the object wasn't normal. It didn't look like any aircraft I recognized. No wings, no tail, just an oval-shaped metallic form, smooth and bright like polished aluminum, but without glare. It didn't bob or drift the way another aircraft might in formation. It sat perfectly still relative to me, like we were tethered. My first instinct was that it had to be a drone. We shared the skies with all sorts of prototypes, and Groom Lake wasn't far. But drones don't fly that close to an active fighter without coordination, and they definitely don't hold position without even a hint of wobble. I rolled into a gentle right bank. The object moved with me, same angle, same arc, same rate. I pulled out of the turn and climbed. It climbed. I dropped a little altitude. It followed. No delay, no lag, just perfect mirroring. I radioed into ATC. Nellis Control, this is Archer 2-1. I have a possible air contact off my right side. Request confirmation. There was a pause. Archer 2-1, we show you clean. No traffic within 30 miles. It's pacing me, I said. Bearing 040, close range. Another pause. Longer. Negative contact, they said again. Confirm no optical artifact? I'm looking right at it, I said. I banked again, a little harder this time. Enough G-force to press me into the seat. The object stayed with me. No drift, no overshoot, no sign it existed on any instrument except my eyes. My pulse kicked up, but I kept my voice steady. I didn't want the controller thinking I was rattled. Control, are you absolutely sure nothing's near me? Affirmative, Archer 2-1, they replied. We're painting the airspace clean. Recommend you return to standard pattern. I didn't know how to respond. I glanced back at the object again. It hadn't changed size or distance. I couldn't make out seams or panels or even a reflection of my jet in its surface. The metal looked wrong, too smooth, too uniform. I shifted slightly in my seat and noticed something odd. Even though the sun was hitting it from the left, it didn't cast a shadow on my wing. At that distance, it should have. I banked left, away from it. It matched my move instantly, now on my left. Archer 2-1, report status, ATC said. I'm still observing the contact, I said. Requesting confirmation from Groom Lake radar. Negative, maintain assigned airspace. Do not approach restricted. I realized then that the object was between me and the restricted zone, pacing me right at the invisible line they always told us not to cross. I tried pulling altitude again, sharper this time. The jet strained slightly, but the object rose just as quickly, never changing its angle. It was like looking in a mirror, except there was no mirror, just this metallic shape pacing me in perfect silence. I didn't hear anything over the radio about it. No chatter, no scramble, no acknowledgement. If they knew something was there, they weren't saying it. A strange feeling washed over me. Not fear exactly, more like confusion mixed with a sense of doing something I shouldn't. I'd flown for years, done training with multiple countries, seen weird prototypes. Nothing ever matched this kind of precision. I forced myself to focus on procedure. Control, Archer 2-1 initiating return vector, I said. Something's off here. Copy, 2-1. Maintain heading 080. Report when level. I took a steady left turn back toward home airspace. The object mirrored the movement again, but something about it shifted, just barely. Instead of staying exactly parallel to me, it rose a bit higher, wet, like it was gaining altitude while still pacing. It was subtle, but noticeable. I waited, hands steady on the stick, trying to predict what it would do next. Then, without any acceleration, it shot upward. No arc, no tilt. One moment it was beside me, the next it was a streak rising straight into the sky at a speed I couldn't begin to estimate. It didn't blur or distort, it just went. Gone in maybe half a second. I blinked hard, craned my neck upward, checked the mirrors. Nothing. Clear air. Empty sky. Archer 2-1 confirmed status, ATC said. Contact has departed, I answered. My voice sounded strange in my own ears. Direction, vertical ascent. Repeat, ATC said. Vertical ascent, I said. Extremely rapid. No telemetry? No tracking, ATC said quietly. Return to base. The rest of the flight back was uneventful, but my chest felt tight the whole way. I kept checking the mirrors, the wings, the shadows, anything that might show the object had come back. It didn't. When I landed, they routed me to a debrief room instead of the usual hangar office. Two officers I didn't know asked me to describe what I'd seen. I explained it exactly as it happened. They asked about size, shape, distance, reflections, sound, shadow. They took notes without reacting. When I mentioned that radar showed nothing, one of them nodded, like that was expected. They ended the debrief by saying I'd experienced visual atmospheric distortion. I'd heard that term thrown around before. It usually meant someone saw heat shimmer and mistook it for something solid. But heat shimmer doesn't pace an aircraft at altitude. I went home late, too wired to sleep. I kept replaying the way it mirrored my turns. No drift, no hesitation. Every slight adjustment matched perfectly, like it wasn't trying to keep up, like it was simply tied to me, mirroring whatever I did. And the way it left, straight up, no acceleration curve, that part sat in my mind like a weight. The next day, I checked the flight logs. Nothing in my vicinity was recorded. The report said I completed standard maneuvers and returned without incident. I didn't bring it up again. I kept flying. Nothing like that ever happened on another flight. But I never forgot the moment the metallic shape rose away from me, as if the sky had swallowed it whole. I was only on site for 9 days, working under a short-term materials contract for a project out near Groom Lake. They didn't call it Area 51 on any paperwork, just Facility K-12. I'd done similar consulting before, usually boring stuff like analyzing stress tolerances in alloys or verifying purity levels in specialty coatings. They brought me in because someone high up wanted independent verification on a sample. That was all they said, the sample. I arrived on a windy February afternoon, cold enough that the gusts cut straight through my jacket. A tech named Braddock met me at the main lab building and walked me through security. He didn't talk much. Most of the staff there didn't. They scanned me, stored my phone, gave me a badge with limited access, and escorted me to a small lab room with no windows and a single workstation. The room already had everything I needed: spectrometer, microscope, magnetic testers, even a small vibration-damped scale. It looked like someone had set it up hours before I arrived. Braddock placed a sealed steel container on the table. "Your sample," he said. "What am I looking for?" I asked. "Document the properties. Don't open it outside the fume hood, and use gloves." That was it. He left and locked the door behind him. I'd worked with dangerous materials before, radioactive samples, volatile compounds, but this felt different. They hadn't given me safety sheets or warnings, just instructions. I opened the containment hood, put on gloves, and unlatched the steel case. Inside was a smaller clear cylinder filled with something dark, not a powder, not a liquid, more like fragments of a dull metallic substance. The pieces looked irregular, almost like chipped flakes, but with unnaturally smooth edges. There was no label, no weight indicated. Nothing. My first test was simple: mass measurement. I placed the cylinder on the scale and waited for the number to stabilize. It bounced around slightly, 2 or 3 grams off in either direction, before locking on a value. That was unusual. The scale was calibrated that morning. It didn't drift. Next, I ran a visual analysis. Under the microscope, the fragments looked strange. The surface wasn't textured, but it also wasn't smooth. It reminded me of glass that had been chipped and then polished halfway through, except it was metallic. When I adjusted the light angle, the pieces seemed to absorb the illumination instead of reflecting it. Not matte, not glossy, just wrong. I tried spectral readings next. The output didn't match anything in the database. Not an alloy, not a composite, not a natural mineral. It had peaks and dips that didn't make sense together. I thought maybe the sample was contaminated or mislabeled, but the container was spotless. Around 8 p.m., I decided to test magnetic responsiveness. I held a small neodymium magnet near the cylinder without touching it. The fragments inside shifted slowly like something in syrup, but not toward the magnet. They tilted away from it. I blinked and tried again. Same result. The pieces angled themselves like they were resisting the field, pushing back even though there was no force that should have made them do that. When I moved the magnet to the other side, the fragments rotated again, always leaning away from it. I'd never seen anything behave like that. Materials either attract, repel, or ignore a magnet. They don't anticipate it. They don't reorient themselves in fluid movements. I noted everything, recorded the angles, and documented the reaction. I wanted to examine the sample outside the cylinder, but didn't have clearance to open it unless someone else was present. I called Braddock on the desk phone. "Any chance someone can supervise a container opening?" I asked. "No," he said immediately. "Not authorized." "Then I can't fully characterize the... Continue with non-invasive tests. Someone will collect the sample tomorrow." He hung up before I could argue. I spent another hour running the magnetic test again with different strengths. Every time, the fragments shifted subtly before settling into a stable orientation, always resisting the field. At 10:14 p.m., the ventilation system in the lab clicked off for a few seconds, not long, maybe 3 or 4, but long enough that the papers on my desk rustled slightly. Then it came back on. The fragments inside the cylinder responded to that too. They trembled, almost vibrating, even though nothing in the room was moving. I wrote it down, but hesitated before trying anything else. By midnight, I had pages of observations, but no explanations. I stepped away from the workstation, stretched, and rubbed my eyes. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, the way fluorescent lights do when the ballast is failing. But the hum felt deeper somehow, like it was coming from behind the wall. I packed my notes and left them on the desk. They didn't allow any materials to leave the room, so everything stayed there for the night. Braddock arrived to escort me out, silent as usual. The next morning, I got to the lab early, hoping to run thermal tests. The steel case was gone. The workstation had been wiped clean. Even my notes were missing. I checked the log clipboard outside the door. No one had signed in after me. No signatures, no entries, no record of removal. Braddock showed up behind me. I didn't hear him approach. "Where's the sample?" I asked. "Collected," he said. "My notes, the readings, everything was forwarded." "To who?" He didn't answer. He just opened the lab door like he expected me to walk inside and pretend nothing strange had happened. "I wasn't done with the analysis," I said. "It was sufficient," he replied. "It wasn't. I didn't even verify mass stability or thermal variance." "Your assignment is complete." He said it in a tone that wasn't rude but final. Like the conversation was over whether I liked it or not. I stepped into the lab anyway. The fume hood was empty. The tray I'd used was missing. Even the glove box liners had been replaced. The room looked like no one had worked there in days. Braddock handed me a single sheet of paper. "Sign out. Transport will take you to the airstrip." "That's it?" I asked. "That's it." I signed because there wasn't anything else to do. When I got back to my hotel in Alamo, I checked my laptop for the draft report I'd started. The file opened, but half the text was gibberish, symbols, blank lines, corrupted paragraphs. The parts describing the magnetic resistance were gone entirely. I had saved it locally, not on any network. I tried rewriting the missing sections from memory, but every time I thought back to the way the fragments moved, something felt off. The movements were slow, subtle, but too intentional, almost like the sample was reacting, not to the magnet itself, but to the approach of the magnet. I told myself it was an illusion, a trick of the fluid inside the cylinder, a misunderstanding of induction forces. But 2 days later, Braddock emailed me a single sentence: "Do not keep personal notes on classified materials." I hadn't told anyone about the corrupted file. I deleted the draft. I didn't hear from them again. But whenever I think about that sample, I remember the way the fragments leaned away from the magnet, slowly, as if they were aware of it before it even touched the glass. I was on the night shift again, sitting in the dim radar room with the hum of the consoles filling the air. The temperature was always too cold in there, like the AC was stuck on one setting, and the overhead lights flickered just enough to make you notice, but not enough to complain. It was early March, windy outside, sand hitting the side of the building in little bursts, the kind of night when even the coyotes stayed quiet. Most of my job was babysitting screens, monitoring air corridors, confirming transponder IDs, logging routine flight paths. 99% of it was dull. The restricted airspace around Groom Lake was usually clean, except for what we already knew was coming. At around 2:17 a.m., something hit the screen. Not literally, just a blip, one small green return in the dead center of the long-range radar sweep. It appeared for a single frame, maybe half a second, then vanished before the sweep even completed. At first, I thought it was noise. Radar does that sometimes. Temperature inversion, stray interference, even birds close to the dish if the wind kicks right. But this one had a velocity tag attached. It estimated the object's speed at something like Mach 20. Impossible. The system shouldn't have even assigned it a number like that. Normally, if something exceeds parameters, it flags the reading as invalid. But it didn't mark it invalid, it marked it event. Then the computer flashed a message. Data error, reclassified as glitch. I sat there for a second, hand hovering over the keyboard, trying to process whether I'd imagined it. The screen had already returned to normal, sweep lines gliding across clean airspace. I rewound the radar feed. The blip didn't appear in playback. That wasn't unusual. Some anomalies happen too fast to get stored. But the part that bothered me was the velocity tag. The system doesn't just invent those. I logged the moment anyway, even though the software had auto-deleted the raw return. I kept the note simple. Errant sweep return, possible interference. About an hour later, during another sweep, I caught myself staring at the exact same spot on the screen. Nothing appeared. The room felt too still. Every shift has a few weird moments, but this left a pit in my stomach in a way I couldn't explain. I tried to shake it off, made coffee, walked around the equipment racks, sat back down. Nothing else happened that night. The next week, during another overnight shift, something similar happened. This time the blip appeared near the northern edge of our range. A single pulse, then gone. Velocity estimate, Mach 18. Same auto-delete, same glitch classification. But I noticed something strange. The system time-stamped the event 2 seconds before it appeared on the screen. That shouldn't happen. The radar sweep doesn't predict returns, it just reads them. I checked the server logs. No mention of the event. No errors. The line just skipped over that minute like nothing happened. The third time, I was prepared, almost hoping it would happen again just so I could prove to myself it wasn't some sleep deprivation trick. It was a windy night, mid-shift quiet, and I was leaning back in my chair when the blip flashed near the center of the screen. Same barely there pulse, same impossible velocity. This time the tag said Mach 22. My heartbeat actually lurched. I hit manual capture so fast I almost knocked my mug off the console. The system froze for half a second, then displayed. Capture failed. File corrupt. Playback remained empty, clean sweep, no anomalies. I leaned close to the monitor, scanning for any faint ghost return, but nothing showed. The airspace looked as untouched as a blank sheet of paper. I logged it again, even though I knew someone upstairs would roll their eyes and mark it as equipment drift. Still, I wrote it down. 3 events in 2 weeks. Same behavior, same pattern. The next night, my supervisor, Klein, stopped by the radar room. He was a tall guy, older, with a way of standing in doorways like he'd been doing it his whole career. "Got your anomaly reports," he said. "You think we need a recalibration?" "Maybe," I said, but the speed tags weren't random noise. The system interpreted something. He nodded like he was listening, but his expression didn't change. "If it happens again, run a self-test and call me." That was it. He didn't ask for details, didn't ask what I thought I'd seen, just left. The 4th event happened at the end of the month. I wasn't tired. I wasn't distracted. I was staring directly at the screen when it appeared. This time the blip lasted slightly longer, maybe a full second. It came in from the west side of the sweep and exited toward the east almost instantly, like a needle pushed through fabric. Velocity tag, Mach 24. Altitude, unreadable. Signature, unreadable. Radar cross-section, unreadable. Everything came up blank except that speed. I hit manual capture again, the system froze, then every monitor flickered at the same time. The room lights dimmed, the AC cut for half a second. When the screens came back, the blip was gone. The radar feed showed nothing unusual. The system logged the event as no data recorded. Except the event ID existed. I clicked it. The file was empty, 0 kilobytes, but the timestamp was there, marked in red. The software wouldn't let me delete it, wouldn't let me open it, wouldn't let me move it. It felt like the system had seen something, stored something, then buried it under its own rules. I checked the raw antenna logs, something most techs don't bother with. They're ugly, high-volume strings of raw signal data. But they should have captured at least a hint of the return. There was a gap, a literal blank area, like someone highlighted a chunk of time and erased it. That had never happened before. I called Klein. He arrived 10 minutes later, quiet as always. I showed him the empty event file, the blank antenna log, the timestamp. He looked at the red mark for a long moment. Then he said calmly, It's a software glitch. It's the fourth time, I said. It happens. How would a glitch hit 4 different radar segments? 4 different sweeps, always tied to the velocity parser? He didn't answer. Instead, he told me to clear my logs for the night and restart the system. We're running a diagnostic at 400, he said. Go grab a coffee. I stepped out of the room because he asked, but I lingered near the hallway just long enough to hear him speaking to someone on the internal phone line. He said, "Another one," and then got quiet when he realized I was still nearby. When I got back, the radar system was mid-reboot and Klein was gone. The anomaly file was gone too. Not just overwritten, gone. The timestamp no longer existed. I didn't report anything else for the rest of the shift. I just watched the clean sweep for 4 more hours, waiting to see if the impossible speed blips would return. They didn't, not that night. Over the next week, nothing strange appeared on the screens. Routine traffic, clean returns, no gaps in the logs. But every time the radar sweep crossed the western edge of our range, my eyes locked onto that exact section of screen where the first blip had appeared. I kept waiting for another impossible streak, another red-tagged velocity, another moment the system failed to keep up with whatever had passed through. And even though the screen stayed empty, I had the same creeping sense every night, that something was moving out there, fast enough to outrun the radar, or fast enough the system pretended it hadn't seen anything at all. When the month ended, I checked the error logs for the whole period. They showed nothing. Clean system. 0 anomalies. But I knew what I'd watched. 4 times, something entered and exited restricted airspace in under a second. Too fast to track, too fast to capture, too fast for the system to even acknowledge. And every time it happened, the radar acted like it hadn't happened at all. I was waiting outside the east checkpoint with my truck idling low, trying to stay warm in the early spring desert cold. It was almost 2 a.m., clear sky, dry air, the kind of night where you could see every star like someone had scrubbed the atmosphere spotless. I'd done plenty of deliveries around Groom Lake before. Sealed crates, electronics, nothing special, and most of the time the guards waved me through after a few minutes. That night they told me to wait until clearance updated, which could mean anything from aircraft traffic to somebody higher up forgetting to sign a form. I stepped out to stretch my legs. The air had that sharp chill that gets into your teeth. There wasn't a sound except the hum of the truck's engine and the distant buzz of floodlights bouncing off the perimeter fence. The guards were inside the booth, arguing quietly about something, leaving me alone in the lot. I looked up at the sky because there was nothing else to do. I don't know much about constellations, but I recognized Orion and the cluster of the Pleiades. They were bright, crisp. The whole sky looked almost fake from how clear it was. Then, while I was staring at a patch of stars near the southern horizon, one of them blinked out. Just one at first. I thought maybe a thin cloud rolled through, but the rest of the sky stayed perfectly sharp. Then, another star next to it dimmed, then 2 more. It wasn't fast. It was slow enough that at first I doubted myself. The dimming happened 1 star at a time, like someone was lowering a curtain over that part of the sky. A dark shape, except I couldn't see the shape itself. Only its outline, defined by what it erased. I leaned forward without even meaning to. My brain kept trying to interpret what I was seeing as a cloud, but clouds don't make perfectly clean edges. And they don't stay pitch black against a sky that bright. This thing didn't glow, didn't shimmer, didn't distort anything around it. It just removed the stars behind it. The area it covered was big, maybe the size of a football field held up in the air, maybe bigger. It moved incredibly slowly, drifting north. If I looked directly at it, it felt like I saw nothing. But when I looked at the stars around it, the shape became obvious from the absence. I kept glancing back toward the guard booth, wanting someone else to see it, but not wanting to shout and sound crazy. They were still inside, heads down. Nobody came out. More stars disappeared as the shape glided overhead. No sound, no wind shift, no vibration. Nothing to tell me it was there except the way the sky was changing. My heart picked up in that weird, slow way where you don't even know if you're scared yet. I remember rubbing my arms like I was cold, even though it wasn't a cold kind of feeling. It was just pressure, like the air got thicker, even though I could breathe fine. The shape kept moving, drifting past the checkpoint and over the access road behind me. If I turned my head slightly, I could see the stars reappearing behind it after it passed, like they were being revealed again. Cleanly. Instantly. No fading in or out. It was like the thing had never been there at all. At one point, I held my breath because I thought I saw a faint outline, just the slightest curve where the edge caught the light wrong. But when I blinked, it was gone. All I could see was the hole it made as it crossed the sky. I checked the booth again, still nobody looking up. I thought about grabbing my phone, but I knew it wouldn't show anything. It was too dark, and the thing itself didn't have lights or shape or surface. It was only visible by subtraction. The drift sped up a little near the end, almost like a breeze caught it, though I didn't feel anything. It moved higher, angling upward slowly until the missing patch of sky got smaller and smaller. Then, without warning, all the stars came back, every single one. No fade in, just instant normal sky. I stared at the spot for another full minute, waiting for it to return. Nothing. A door opened behind me. One of the guards, Turner, a younger guy I'd chatted with before, stepped out and walked around the booth like he was checking the generators. "You good out here?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, still staring at the sky. Was anything moving up there just now?" He barely glanced upward. "No aircraft traffic tonight. Airspace is locked." "What about, like, something without lights? Something big?" He raised an eyebrow. "You see something?" I hesitated. The words felt stupid even before I said them. "I thought I saw a shadow, blocking stars." He looked up again, longer this time, then shrugged. "Crystal clear tonight. You probably saw a plane banking without strobes." "There wasn't any noise," I said. "They run quiet sometimes, classified stuff." Maybe that explanation should have comforted me, but it didn't. Planes don't erase constellations, and they don't drift that slowly. Turner checked his tablet, tapped something, then waved me forward. "Clearance updated. You're good to go." I climbed back into my truck, but I sat there for a moment with the engine idling, watching the sky out the windshield. Every star was exactly where it should have been. I drove through the checkpoint and didn't say anything else. Nobody asked me what I'd been looking at. Nobody mentioned anything unusual. When I got home at dawn, I tried to recreate in my head how large the shape had been. I couldn't. My memory kept shrinking and expanding it, like the scale was impossible to hold on to. What stuck with me was the moment all the stars came back at once, like someone flipped them on. I checked weather reports later, no clouds, no atmospheric disturbances, but I knew what I saw. Something passed overhead, huge and silent and invisible, except for the sky it swallowed. And by the time I pointed it out to anyone, it was already gone. I reached the site just after sunrise, though the call had come in a little after 3 a.m. A rancher named Clyde Haber swore he'd seen lights dancing low over the flats, which wasn't unusual for this part of Nevada. Folks out here saw test flights all the time, but Clyde wasn't the excitable type. He'd lived near Groom Lake his whole life and never called us unless something genuinely bothered him. The morning was cold, below freezing, with a pale orange haze creeping over the desert. Everything felt muffled, like sound didn't want to travel. I parked my cruiser just off a dirt track and started walking toward the coordinates Clyde gave me. He wasn't kidding. There was something out there. About 100 yards from where I parked, I found a perfectly round patch of glass fused into the sand. Not melted-looking sand, not scorched earth. Actual glass. Smooth, tinted slightly green, like the stuff you see in old bottles. The circle was maybe 12 feet across, and the edges were sharp where sand met glass. I crouched down and laid my hand near the edge. It was warm, not hot enough to burn, just warm. On a freezing morning, heat rising off it like a space heater under a blanket. I walked the perimeter, trying to see if anything else around it had been affected. No scorch marks, no impact spray, no debris. The creosote bushes nearby weren't burned or bent. Even the sand just a foot outside the glass circle was untouched. Meteor fragments don't do that, at least not without leaving a crater or shrapnel or something. I radioed dispatch. "Got a fused patch here, circular, no debris." "Copy, Sheriff," dispatch said. "Air Force requests you hold position. They're sending someone." Of course they were. While I waited, I walked a wider circle, scanning for anything Clyde might have described. He said the lights were jumping around like fireflies, except too big, too low, too steady. I didn't see any footprints except my own. No tire tracks, no signs anyone had been here before me. But something felt off. The air above the glass had a weird shimmer. Not heat distortion exactly, but something similar. Like looking at a mirage, except this wasn't the right temperature or time of day for that. I knelt again and touched the center of the glass through my glove. It was even warmer there. The heat didn't match the environment at all. The sun wasn't strong enough to warm anything that fast. And this wasn't just on the surface. It felt like the warmth was coming from below, radiating upward. A shape moved in the corner of my eye, and I stood up fast. Nothing there. Just the open desert and a few distant ridges. I rubbed my face and exhaled, watching the fog of my breath drift sideways. It hit me then that the glass patch wasn't giving off steam or fog, even though it was much warmer than the air. It should have made some kind of visible distortion, but everything stayed perfectly still above it except that faint ripple. I kept waiting. The Air Force finally arrived around 7:30. Two men in unmarked fatigues stepped out of a white truck. One introduced himself as Captain Rowe. The other didn't say anything at all. Rowe walked straight to the glass patch without asking me a single question. He crouched, touched the surface, nodded like he already knew what he'd find. "How warm was it when you got here?" he asked. "Still is," I said. "No change." "That happens," he said. "To fused sand?" I asked. "Meteor fragment," he said immediately. "Probably broke apart before impact. Heat flash can melt surface layers without leaving a crater. That's not how." I stopped myself. Arguing never helped with these guys. There's no entry trace, no debris, no trail, nothing overhead on the cameras. "Meteor fragment," he repeated. "We'll secure the site." He and the silent guy laid out small orange markers around the circle, then started taking measurements. They didn't act surprised by anything, not the warmth, not the perfect shape, not the lack of any other damage. I stepped back a few feet and watched. Rowe used a handheld device, looked like a thermal scanner, but he didn't show me the readings. The other guy placed small sample vials along the edge of the glass, scraping tiny bits into containers. "Anything else you observed?" Rowe asked. Just the warmth," I said. "And Clyde mentioned lights." Rowe wrote something on his clipboard. "Atmospheric reflections. Happens before meteors break up." "They were low," I said, "and moving sideways." He didn't respond. Suddenly, the breeze shifted. Just a small gust, but it pushed dust across the desert floor. When it reached the glass patch, the dust split around it, flowing in two clean paths like the air pressure was different above the circle. Rowe noticed. He glanced at the spot, then at the sky, then back at me. "We'll handle the rest," he said. "You can clear out." I stayed put. "I'm the reporting officer. I need something for Clyde." "Tell him it was a meteor fragment," he said again. "Nothing dangerous." The other guy stopped taking samples just then and stood still, staring at the center of the glass. His head tilted slightly, like he was listening to something. Rowe snapped his fingers at him. The man didn't react. "Heart?" Rowe said quietly. The man blinked, straightened, and resumed labeling containers. Rowe didn't explain anything. I walked the perimeter again, this time farther out. About 30 yards from the circle, I noticed something odd in the sand, tiny beads of greenish glass scattered like spilled pellets. Not fused, just loose. They were warm too, though not as warm as the main patch. I collected a few in a glove and brought them back. "Part of your meteor?" I asked Rowe. He didn't look at them. "Debris from the primary melt zone." "Then why aren't there more?" I asked. "And why aren't they cooling off?" He didn't answer. He just stepped between me and the circle, blocking my view. "Sheriff," he said, voice flat, "you've done your part. This is no longer your scene." I stood there for a few seconds, watching dust continue to divide around the circle like an invisible shield was pushing it aside. Then I turned and walked back to my cruiser. Before I got in, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. Hart, the silent man, was standing dead center on the glass, just standing there. No equipment, no tools, not touching anything. Rowe was several feet away, writing again. Hart lifted one hand slowly, like he was feeling the air. He stayed like that for a long moment. Then Rowe barked something at him, and Hart snapped back to work. I drove off without asking more questions. An hour later, when I checked the incident report system, the entire file was locked. Not flagged, locked. Even I couldn't open it. When I called to ask why, I was told the Air Force classified the event as an astronomical anomaly. But I kept thinking about that glass, the warmth that didn't fade, the perfect circle, the dust splitting neatly around it. Meteor fragments don't act like that. Nothing I know does. And whatever happened out there in the dark, it left no crater, no debris field, just a warm, silent circle of glass waiting in the middle of the desert. They came in around 2:40 a.m., which was already strange because the cafeteria technically closed at 1. I was the night cook, though, so I was usually still around prepping breakfast stuff. Cracking eggs into tubs, slicing fruit, restocking coffee. The night shifts were quiet, mostly security guys drifting through for caffeine or someone from the flight line grabbing leftovers before heading out. But this group wasn't like the usual late-night crowd. 4 of them walked in together, all wearing the same plain gray jumpsuits with blank badges. No rank, no unit, no name tapes. Just a barcode and a clearance stripe I didn't recognize. Their boots were clean, like they hadn't been outside. Their faces looked tired, but not in the normal way. More unfocused, like they didn't fully register where they were. They didn't talk to each other, didn't look at each other. They just lined up quietly at the counter while I scrambled to set out trays. "Morning," I said, even though it wasn't morning yet. None of them responded. One of the guards on late watch, Peterson, walked in behind them. He gave me this small nod that basically meant just roll with it. I'd learned early that there were parts of this base you didn't ask about. I served them eggs, toast, coffee. Their hands shook a little when they picked up the cups. Not like they were cold, more like they were worn out. One guy's pupils were huge, as if he'd stepped out of a dark room into bright light, even though the cafeteria was dim. They sat together, but didn't speak. They ate slowly, almost mechanically. After 10 minutes, they all stood at once, placed their trays on the rack, and walked out without a word. When they were gone, Peterson stepped up to the counter. "Don't log them," he murmured. "They're on a different manifest." That was all he said. The next time I saw them was a week later. Another quiet night, but this time it was storming. Wind hammering the siding, rain slanting across the windows. They came in soaked, even though the walkway from their building to ours was covered. Their jumpsuits clung to them like they'd walked through mist rather than rain. Same blank badges, same distant look. One of them stared at the menu board for a long time. It wasn't complicated: eggs, potatoes, oatmeal. But he looked at it like he was trying to remember what any of those things were. "You okay?" I asked before I could stop myself. He blinked slowly. "What day?" he said, then paused, searching for the next word. "What day is this?" "It's Thursday," I said, trying to sound casual. He nodded, but not like someone confirming a fact, more like someone filing away information they weren't sure about. They ate again. Quiet, shaky hands, no conversation. When they left, I noticed something else. Their boots were bone dry, completely clean. Not a speck of mud or water on the floor behind them, even though the storm was still raging outside. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. They probably came through a maintenance tunnel or something. But the air around them had felt weirdly warm, like the humidity followed them into the cafeteria. 2 weeks passed before I saw them again. This time only 3 showed up. I kept looking at the door, waiting for the 4th, but he never came. Peterson wasn't with them that night, which made me more nervous. They lined up the same way as before, silent, stiff, not quite in sync with each other. They didn't look sick, exactly, just disoriented, like they were still adjusting to the room. The guy who'd asked about the day last time stepped forward. He looked slightly more alert than before, but still off, like he hadn't fully woken up. "What year is it?" he asked. He said it casually, like someone asking what time it was, not like someone confused about reality. I froze with the ladle halfway into the potatoes. 2024, I said. He frowned. Not shocked, not frightened, just mildly confused. He nodded slowly and stepped aside without another word. When they sat down, I watched from behind the counter. They ate, but only the eggs. Everything else they pushed aside. One of them kept glancing at the ceiling like he was listening for something. When they left, the air around their table stayed warm for a minute, like the heat hadn't caught up to the room yet. The next morning, I asked Peterson about them. He shut it down immediately. "They're transient personnel," he said. "Don't worry about them." That doesn't explain anything. He stared at me for a long moment. Just don't ask questions about gray badges. Trust me. I didn't push it after that. But the strangest part came later, during another night shift when the cafeteria was empty except for me and one dishwasher. I heard footsteps in the hallway, multiple pairs, light, synchronized. I expected the group again, but when I looked up, no one came in. The footsteps continued past the door, getting fainter like they were moving down a corridor that didn't exist on that side of the building. The dishwasher heard it too. He lifted his head, confused. "Someone out there?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, though I didn't believe it. I stepped into the hall. Empty. No doors opening. No guards. No sound except the ventilation system. When I got back, the dishwasher looked unsettled. "Thought you said someone was there." "I thought so," I said. "That was the last week of my contract. I didn't see the gray badge group again, though I found their paper cups in a trash bin early one morning. 3 cups, not 4. I told myself the missing guy must have been reassigned. Or maybe he rotated out. Or maybe he just ate somewhere else. There were plenty of explanations if you wanted them. But I kept thinking about the moment he asked what year it was. Not frightened, not panicked, just casually unsure, like someone checking a detail they used to know but couldn't quite pin down. And I never saw any of their faces in the mess hall again. Not once, even during day shifts. Sometimes, when I'm lying awake, I picture them walking into that cafeteria, silent, disoriented, moving like they weren't used to gravity or light or sound, like they weren't coming off a long flight so much as arriving from somewhere they couldn't talk about. And I keep hearing that question. What year is it? I saw the figure about 40 minutes before full dark, on a ridge maybe half a mile from where I'd stopped to rest. I'd been hiking near the restricted boundary, still on public land, but close enough that you could see the warning signs through binoculars. The sky was turning that dull purple you only get in the desert, and the wind had picked up just enough to make the brush click against itself. I wasn't thinking about anything strange. I was mostly annoyed at myself for misjudging how long the loop trail would take. I had another hour of hiking ahead of me, and my legs already felt like rubber. I took a drink of water, sat down on a flat rock, and looked toward the ridge. That's when I saw it, a tall, thin silhouette standing near the crest, too tall to be a normal person, at least from the distance I was at. The proportions looked wrong. Not freakishly wrong, just elongated. The arms were long, the legs were long. The posture was straight, stiff, like someone balancing on a narrow ledge without moving. I figured it was a ranger or a lookout at first. Maybe someone from base security checking the fence lines. But the figure didn't shift at all, not even when the wind gusted. Most people would have braced or adjusted their stance. I raised my binoculars to see better. The shape didn't come into focus the way it should have. It wasn't blurry exactly, just indistinct. The outline stayed sharp, but the details refused to resolve. I couldn't see clothing, couldn't see features, couldn't tell if it was facing me or facing away. Just a dark, tall figure rooted to the ridge like a fence post. I lowered the binoculars and looked with my naked eyes again. It was still there. I kept telling myself it was just a trick of the light, a weird rock, maybe. There were plenty of tall, narrow rock formations around that area, but something about the shape looked too clean, too straight. I watched it while I ate a protein bar. It didn't move once. By the time full dusk hit, the temperature was dropping fast. The desert goes cold quickly after sunset, and that evening felt colder than usual. My breath was visible, even though the sun had just dipped below the hills. The silhouette didn't shiver or shift or hunch its shoulders. It just stayed upright, perfectly still. I was debating packing up and hiking back early when I heard the rumble of an engine somewhere behind me. A patrol truck. I'd seen them on previous hikes. Usually white, usually slow-moving, checking for trespassers near the border fence. The engine noise got louder, bouncing off the rock walls. I didn't want them thinking I was too close to restricted land, so I stepped a few yards downslope to make myself visible. The headlights swept across the ridge just for a second, and the figure was gone, not moved. Gone. One moment the silhouette stood clear as anything against the sky, and the next the ridge was empty. No scrambling movement, no slipping rock sounds, no blur of motion. I blinked hard, thinking maybe the lights just washed it out. But when the truck passed and darkness settled again, the ridge stayed empty. I stared at the spot for a long time, holding my binoculars so tight the rubber eyepieces dug into my skin. Nothing reappeared. Eventually, the cold got sharp enough that I had to start moving. I stuck to the marked trail, glancing back every few minutes. The ridge remained still, just a jagged line against the starless purple sky. When I finally reached my truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching me move the entire time. I kept checking my rearview mirror all the way back to the highway. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that silhouette standing perfectly still while the world shifted around it. The next morning, after convincing myself I had probably spooked at a rock or a bush shaped just right, I decided to hike back out and check the ridge in daylight. It wasn't far, maybe a half-hour trek from the parking pullout. The sun was bright, the air warmer, and the desert looked completely normal again. I climbed the hill where I'd sat the night before. From that vantage point, the ridge looked smaller, less dramatic, just a standard desert formation. I made my way up the ridge carefully. Loose gravel shifted under my boots, and the slope was steeper than it had looked from a distance. When I reached the top, I walked the entire crest, looking for footprints or scuffed rocks, anything that would show someone had stood there. Nothing. No prints. No crushed brush. No heel marks. Even in desert conditions, you expect at least some disturbance if a person had been standing still for that long. The ground looked untouched. I knelt and ran my hand over the gravel. It was smooth and cold, undisturbed. I checked every logical explanation I could think of. Could someone have been standing there and climbed down the other side? Maybe. But the drop on the far side was steep, a slanted rock face with loose shale that would have made a ton of noise if someone slid or climbed it. And even if they had moved the second the headlights hit, they wouldn't have vanished instantly. There was nowhere to hide. I tried to find the exact angle where I'd seen the silhouette the night before. When I matched the perspective, I looked at the rocks and brush, hoping something would line up into the same shape. Nothing did. Every shrub had irregular edges. Every rock was too thick or too short or too angled. The silhouette had been too tall, too narrow, too smooth-edged to be anything on that ridge. I stayed there longer than I meant to, hoping some trace would reveal itself. A broken twig, a displaced stone, anything. But the ridge looked like no one had stood there in years. Eventually, I started back down, but as I reached the halfway point of the hill, I felt something shift in the air around me. Not wind, more like pressure. The kind you feel before a storm, except the sky was clear and the day was bright. I looked up at the ridge. For a second, I thought I saw a shape, just a flicker, a darker patch against the stone. But when I blinked, it was gone. I told myself it was nothing, a crow's shadow, a cloud passing overhead. But the sky was empty. I got back to my truck and sat there with the engine running, hands gripping the wheel harder than I meant to. I kept expecting to see someone standing far off on the ridge again, watching. Nothing appeared. When I drove out, I checked the rearview mirror again and again. The ridge looked normal, just rock and sand and scrub. But even now, when I think back on that moment, when the headlights swept across the ridge and erased the figure instantly, I can't match it to anything I know. Something had been standing there. Something tall, thin, motionless for over an hour. And whatever it was, it left no trace at all. I heard the knocking about 20 minutes after I got to the substation. It was late afternoon, hot enough that the metal railings burned your hands if you weren't careful. The sky had that washed-out look Nevada gets right before dusk, when everything feels dry and stretched thin. I'd been sent out to check a transformer unit that kept throwing minor voltage dips. Nothing dramatic, just enough that the monitoring team flagged it. The substation sat on a lonely patch of desert about 6 miles from the restricted boundary. I'd been out there plenty of times. Usually the place felt empty, like nothing had touched it in months except wind and sun. That day was no different. No birds, no insects, no distant traffic. Just the hum of the equipment and the occasional click from cooling metal. I ran my diagnostic tablet along the usual spots, checking connectors and grounding rods. Everything seemed normal. The problem wasn't showing itself, which usually meant it was something tiny, loose insulation, dust intrusion, thermal expansion. I was leaning against the fence, writing a note, when I heard it. 3 knocks. Slow, evenly spaced, coming from inside Transformer 2A. I froze and listened. Nothing followed. Just the usual low electrical hum. I walked over to the unit. Transformer 2A was sealed tight, bolts locked, casing intact, no signs of tampering. There was no way anything living could have gotten inside. Even rats avoided substations. They didn't like the vibration. I pressed my ear against the metal housing. At first I heard nothing, the faint thrum of current. Then knock, knock, knock. Each knock was spaced about a second apart. Rhythmic, not random. Not like metal expanding with heat, more like someone tapping from the inside with deliberate pressure. I stepped back, heartbeat picking up in that slow, dragging way where your body's trying to understand what it just heard. I checked the gauges. No abnormal pressure, no temperature spikes, no electromagnetic surges. Everything looked perfectly ordinary except for the sound. I radioed my supervisor, Vaughn. Unit 2A's making noise, I said. What kind of noise, he asked. Knocking, I said. He actually laughed. Thermal shift. Happens when the casing cools. It's not cooling, I said. Not at these temps, and the spacing's too even. You hearing voices too, he said. Finish your checks and call it. I didn't bother arguing. Vaughn rarely took anything seriously unless something was on fire. I grabbed my toolkit and unbolted the access panel. It took effort in the heat, metal swells a bit, but I got it open and set the panel aside. The interior looked exactly like it should. Dry, clean, oil levels normal, coil insulation intact, no signs of arcing or contact burns, no loose metal that could have been tapping. I checked every weld, every bracket. Nothing was loose enough to make sound. If anything, the interior felt unnervingly still. When I leaned in deeper, the hum went quieter, like the unit had dampened itself. I didn't hear a single knock. I waited 5 minutes. Still nothing. I reassembled the casing, bolting it shut. The metal radiated leftover heat as I tightened the last bolt. Right as I stepped back, the knocking resumed. This time it was 4 knocks. Same pace, same sound, like someone with patient hands tapping from the inside. I felt something cold creep up my back despite the heat. I wasn't jumpy by nature. I'd worked substations for years. I'd heard plenty of weird sounds, buzzing, rattling, transformer sing, even the occasional popping from voltage surges. But this wasn't any of those. I opened the casing again immediately. Same result, silence. Normal interior, nothing abnormal. I waited longer this time, half inside the unit with my flashlight angled deep into the coils. The sun dipped lower, the shadows lengthened, and the temperature eased slightly. Still nothing. I closed it again, trying to decide whether I was imagining the rhythm, when the knocking started once more. 3 knocks. A pause. Then 2 more. I backed up several steps. My throat felt tight, like the air got heavier. The desert around the substation had gone completely still. No wind, no shifting sand, no clinking of the fence. Just the transformer and those knocks. I checked my tablet again. The voltage was steady. Frequency normal, no load changes. No reason for any internal movement. I did something I normally wouldn't. I recorded the outside of the casing with my phone. 10 seconds, 20. I caught the knocks on audio, faint but unmistakable. I opened the unit again to compare. Silence. By then, the sun had dipped behind the mountains, leaving everything in that orange-blue half-light that never lasts long enough to make you comfortable. I flipped on my work light and shone it inside, scanning every surface. No animals, no insects, no loose parts, no signs of any foreign object, just a smooth, humming shell. I called Vaughn again. I'm telling you, I said, keeping my voice steady. There's knocking. Every time it's closed, it knocks. Every time I open it, it stops. He sighed. I'll send a truck in the morning. Just button everything up and go home. I want to document it first, I said. Fine, but don't start taking the unit apart. We don't need another downtime report. He hung up. I took one last look inside, then sealed the casing again, tightening the bolts in sequence. For a moment, everything was quiet except the hum. Then, right on cue, the knocking resumed. This time, it wasn't rhythmic. It was slower, like someone unsure. 1 knock, then a pause, then another. My shoulders tensed. I backed away, almost tripping on a coil of cable. I scanned the desert behind me. The light was fading fast now, the sky washed out, the ridges turning into dark shapes. No sign of anyone, no movement, just open land. But the feeling that something was off wouldn't go away. I circled the transformer, knocking on the casing myself. It responded with the dull, hollow echo it should have. But the internal knock didn't match it. The internal knock was sharper, more controlled, like it came from something small and solid hitting the metal from inside. I checked my phone recording again. The knocks were clear enough that I knew I wasn't mishearing. It was fully dark by then. The substation lights flicked on automatically, humming to life. The sudden brightness made the shadows even harsher. Another knock, then another. I couldn't bring myself to open the casing a third time. Something in me felt watched. Not by a person, not by an animal, just this sensation that the space around me had changed. The silence between knocks felt too heavy. I packed my tools slowly, deliberately. I kept glancing at the transformer, waiting for something else, movement, a change in tone, anything. The knocking didn't change, just steady, patient, like it waited for me to finish. I got in my truck, logged my departure, and started driving. The desert road felt narrower than usual. I kept checking the rearview mirror even though I didn't know what I expected to see. A figure, a light, something following. I saw nothing, just my own taillights bouncing off the dust. When I got home, I listened to the recording again. The knocking was there, 5 distinct taps. The next morning, I drove back early to meet the crew. Transformer 2A was silent. We opened it together. Everything looked normal, perfectly normal. I played them the audio, static, wind, no knocking. The file had corrupted, or maybe it never had anything on it except the sounds I imagined. That's what Vaughn hinted anyway. But I know what I heard. 3 knocks, then 4, then the slow ones as the sun went down, each one echoing from inside a sealed unit that had nothing inside capable of making sound. And every time I opened it, whatever knocked went quiet. I noticed the first disturbance late in the afternoon, when the sky was clear enough that you could count every ridge on the far mountains. I was stationed out near the Western Monitoring Station, which sat on a raised platform overlooking a row of isolated hangars. My job wasn't exciting, mostly checking atmospheric readings, logging air temperature shifts, cataloging wind direction patterns. The desert is predictable, dry, steady, calm, especially in early summer. That day, the air was still, the sun was bright, and there wasn't a cloud anywhere within 100 miles. But a thin patch of vapor drifted into view over Hangar 14. At first, I thought it was just dust kicked up by ground vehicles, but it was too high for that and too condensed. It formed a tight cluster directly above the roof, maybe 20 or 30 feet above it, no higher, and it stayed there, barely moving. I wiped my sunglasses with my shirt and looked again. The rest of the sky remained perfectly clear. The little cloud pulsed, just slightly, like static building inside it. A faint flicker flashed inside the vapor, almost like distant heat lightning. But heat lightning doesn't happen in a patch the size of a sedan. I pulled out my handheld anemometer and scanned for any wind anomaly. Nothing. Zero movement. Complete calm. I radioed the weather office. "Do you have any microburst activity near Hangar 14? After a long pause, they replied, "Negative. Sky's clean." "Why?" I didn't answer right away. I just stared at the small cloud as another faint light flickered inside it, bright enough that I saw the edges glow. "Just checking," I finally said. By the time I climbed the platform ladder to get a closer look, the cloud was gone. The air above the hangar looked normal again, no trace of moisture, no heat distortion, like nothing had been there at all. I shrugged it off. Dust. Exhaust. Some odd reflection. That's what I told myself all evening. But the next morning, it happened again. I was logging sunrise temperatures when the vapor reformed. Same place, same height, same size, like someone had drawn a circle in the air where it belonged. The rest of the sky was still empty, pale blue, thin clouds on the far horizon, but nothing overhead. I zoomed the field camera in. The screen showed a brightening in the center of the cloud, like a single flashbulb going off behind cotton. I checked satellite imagery on my console. Above average clarity, 0 cloud cover reported. When I returned to the camera feed, the cloud was gone again, and once again there was no trace of it afterward. The humidity readings didn't tick up, the temperature didn't shift, nothing registered. By afternoon, I couldn't stop thinking about it, so I walked down toward that section of the base, carefully, staying outside restricted zones. Hangar 14 looked ordinary. Gray, windowless, same faded numbers on the side. If anything, it looked abandoned. No movement, no personnel coming or going, no vehicles parked nearby. I heard something faint as I got closer, not a sound exactly, more like a pressure. The air felt tight, the way it does before a storm starts to form, but there wasn't a cloud around for miles. I stood there long enough to feel stupid, then went back to my station. Later that night, around 9:30, when the sky was black and the temperature had dropped into the low 60s, the cloud reappeared. This time, I watched from the elevated monitoring tower, the only spot where I could see the hangar roof clearly. The cloud formed like it had been waiting for darkness. A faint shimmer first, then a swirl of vapor pulled together by something unseen. Then the flashes began, tiny, fast, irregular bursts of light inside the cloud. Not lightning, wrong color, wrong speed. Not sparks, too bright and too uniform. They flickered like someone shaking a flashlight under a blanket. I radioed the night tech. Jamie, do we have electrical testing near 14? No, he said. Nothing scheduled. You hearing something? Not hearing, I said. Seeing. I've got satellite up right now, he replied. Sky's clear, zero cloud formations. Not according to my eyes. He didn't respond to that. I took a few photos with my phone, blurry, grainy, but enough to show something was there, or at least enough to prove to myself I wasn't imagining things. I watched until the cloud dissolved again, which took maybe 10 seconds. The edges frayed, the vapor thinned, and the flashes faded. When it disappeared, the sky turned calm and empty again, like someone had wiped it clean. The next afternoon, I brought it up casually in the break room. A few of the older meteorology guys exchanged looks but didn't say much. One finally said, "Weather near that hangar's always been weird." "Weird how?" I asked. He shrugged. "Localized anomalies, never shows on satellite." "Why not?" "Wrong type of disturbance," he said, "or the right type, depending how you look at it." I pressed him for more, but he wouldn't elaborate. The cloud appeared again 3 nights later, same size, same spot. This time it hung there longer, almost 2 full minutes. The flashes inside were brighter too, enough that the roof below lit up briefly. I scanned the air with the field sensor. No charge buildup, no temperature spike, no energy readings. The instruments showed dead calm, but the cloud pulsed again. Then a sharp streak of light cut through the vapor and vanished before I could blink. No thunder, no sound at all, just a flicker. My heart hammered against my ribs in a slow, heavy way. It wasn't fear exactly. More like my body realized something was wrong long before my brain could make sense of it. I zoomed the camera all the way in. For a moment, just one shallow breath, I thought I saw a shape under the cloud, a faint curve like the top of something metallic catching the flash. But the vapor swirled and blocked the view before I could get a clear look. I reset the focus. Nothing there, no shape, no cloud, no light. I reviewed the recording. The camera had frozen at the moment of the streak and resumed only after the cloud vanished. No error message, no glitch report. It simply skipped the frames. Jamie came up to the tower later that night. He took one look at my screen and frowned. "You trying to analyze those readings from this afternoon?" he asked. "Yeah," I lied. "You look spooked." "I'm fine." He leaned against the console, lowering his voice. "If you ever see anything over 14, anything, you didn't." "You've seen something too?" I asked. He didn't answer. He just kept staring at the empty sky through the tower window. I didn't see the disturbance again for 2 full weeks. I started to think maybe it was over. Maybe whatever test was happening there had ended. Then one foggy morning, rare weather for our area, the vapor appeared lower than before, almost touching the roof. The fog around the base made the cloud blend in at first, but once the flashes started, I knew exactly what I was looking at. Bright pulses lit the mist from the inside, making the entire patch glow faintly. The fog around it stayed dull and flat, only that small, perfect circle flickered. I looked through the binoculars again. This time I caught a clearer glimpse of the shape under the cloud. A smooth curve, seamless. No markings, no angles, like the top of a polished dome. Just as I focused, the cloud collapsed inward and vanished. I lowered the binoculars slowly. The fog moved again, creeping across the ground like nothing had happened. But the dome shape, I knew what I saw, even if it made no sense. When I pulled up the satellite feed for that exact minute, the image showed complete clarity. No fog, no clouds, no disturbance at all. I checked the meteorological logs. No anomalies detected. I checked the camera footage. The video jumped directly from 6:12.3 to 6:12.9. 6 seconds gone. Later that day, I asked the older meteorologist again about Hangar 14. He only said one thing: whatever forms over that building isn't weather. And none of it appears in the data that should have recorded everything. I first noticed the landings during a stretch of night shifts in late autumn, when the temperature dropped fast after sunset and the desert air felt sharper than usual. I worked approach control for Groom Lake's auxiliary field. Nothing glamorous, just routing authorized aircraft through their final descent and keeping the radar picture clean. Most nights were predictable. Scheduled test flights, transient military jets, the occasional cargo run. Everything had a paper trail. Everything had a transponder code. Everything showed up on radar. Except on certain nights, the runway lights came on without anyone calling for them. The first time it happened, I was alone in the control room. It was close to 1:30 a.m. The building hummed the way old equipment does, steady, comforting. I was halfway through a cup of stale coffee when the automated runway indicator blinked from standby to active. I looked at the radar, nothing. No inbound aircraft, no transponder squawk, no unidentified movement. The airspace was clean. Sometimes the technicians ran self-tests on the light systems, so I called ground. "You guys cycling the runway?" I asked. "Nope," they said. "We're not touching anything." Lights just went active. Negative from us. I leaned closer to the panel. The runway edges lit up on the feed, bright white against the darkness. The approach lights strobed in sequence, like a plane was on short final. "Control, verify no scheduled arrivals," I said. "There are none," they responded. But the lights stayed on. I checked every channel, tower, ground, maintenance. Everyone said the same thing: no incoming traffic. After about 90 seconds, the lights dimmed and returned to standby. I stared at the panel long after they shut off, trying to convince myself it was a glitch. The second time, it was windier. The whole building shook with gusts from the north, and static crawled across the radios. I was monitoring a westbound test flight still 20 minutes from approach when the indicator blinked active again. This time, I watched the runway camera more closely. The lights didn't just flick on, they ramped up slowly, exactly as they would if someone in a cockpit had triggered the approach system. The sequencing strobes fell into their pattern, guiding something invisible toward touchdown. But radar remained clear. No signatures, no blips, no transponder echo, not even a flicker of raw return. I zoomed the camera feed. Nothing was on the runway, no dust displacement, no heat shimmer. Just bright lights aimed at a non-existent aircraft. I called Tower. "You seeing this?" Tower replied, "Lights activated automatically. No flight plan entered." "No primary return anywhere near?" "Negative. Sky's empty." The lights stayed on longer this time, almost 3 minutes before shutting down. When the test pilot I'd been tracking came in later, he reported nothing strange in the air. "Dark night, smooth ride," he said. "Didn't see any traffic." The third time made my skin crawl. It was close to midnight, clear sky, no wind. I'd been reviewing earlier logs when the active indicator flashed again, and the lights ramped up fast like whatever triggered them was close. I switched immediately to the infrared runway feed. That was when I saw it, just for a fraction of a second. A faint patch of heat distortion at the far end of the runway, moving downward like something descending too quickly for the system to render properly. No shape, no outline, just warm air shifting where nothing should have been. Then it vanished. The lights stayed bright for about 40 seconds afterward, then dropped. I breathlessly rewound the video. The distortion wasn't there. Not scrubbed, not corrupted, just not there at all. I tried again. Nothing. I called up to Tower. "Please tell me you saw something on your visual." "Nothing," they said. "Runway is cold and clear." I didn't sleep much that morning. My dreams were static and runway lights flickering by themselves. After the fourth time, I started keeping handwritten notes. I wasn't supposed to. Everything had to be logged digitally, but I didn't trust the system. Every time I checked the stored data for those nights, timestamps were missing, or event markers were blank, or the approach logs were rearranged as if they'd been overwritten. The weird part wasn't that the entries vanished, it was how cleanly they vanished, like the system had been reset only for select blocks of time. Then there was the night everything happened at once. It was just after 2 a.m. The wind had died completely. The radar picture was smooth. No scheduled aircraft, no expected activity. I was half reading a maintenance report when the active indicator blinked again. Before I could react, the lights ramped to full intensity. The strobes ran their sequence. The taxiway lights flicked on too, something that normally only happened when ground control cleared an aircraft to exit the runway. I froze, watching the monitors. Control to ground. You activating taxi? No, they said, alarmed. We're not doing anything. Systems are responding to a trigger. What trigger? Unknown. The radar screen remained empty. I leaned forward, staring hard. Sometimes the raw return captures faint anomalies before primary and secondary radar do, but even raw mode was blank. Then the runway camera flickered. Just once. A shape maybe passed through the edge of the frame. Barely there. A shimmer, like heat haze wrapped around a moving object. Then darkness again. Tower, anything visual? I asked. Negative. The lights stayed on for nearly 5 minutes this time. When they finally shut down, the room felt colder, though nothing in the environment had changed. I checked the logs immediately. Nothing recorded. The system showed an uninterrupted idle period. I knew that wasn't right because I'd watched the lights cycle moments earlier. I searched deeper into maintenance files, timestamp buffers, anything that might retain residual data. Empty. The next morning, I brought it up quietly with my supervisor, Harris. I didn't push hard. I knew better than to sound certain about things I couldn't prove. He didn't look surprised. Instead, he asked, "Do you have any reason to believe unauthorized aircraft entered controlled airspace?" I didn't see an aircraft, I said carefully. But something activated the systems. He pinched the bridge of his nose. If it didn't appear on radar, and Tower didn't see it, then nothing landed. Sir, the lights. Happened due to automated testing, he said firmly. Drop it. I didn't drop it entirely, but I stopped talking about it. In the remaining months I worked there, the runways lit up 4 more times. Each event happened on nights with no wind, no scheduled flights, and no radar returns. Each time, the lights behaved exactly as if a real aircraft was on final approach. Every log from those nights is missing now. Not edited. Missing. Like no one had been on shift at all. I don't know what landed. I don't even know if landed is the right word. All I know is the runway lights don't activate unless something tells them to. And something told them to over and over when nothing was supposed to be in the sky at all. I was in Building C12 the night it happened, working in one of the smaller server rooms tucked behind a maze of blank hallways. Most of the IT work they gave contractors like me was routine. Patch updates, network maintenance, clearing old logs, stuff nobody else wanted to stay late for. It was a cold night, even inside the building. The AC in that wing always ran too strong, and the vents rattled like they were loose in the ceiling. I'd been there since about 7 p.m., long after most of the daytime personnel cleared out. Only a few security staff stayed on that late. They didn't talk much, just nodded as they passed, boots echoing down the concrete hallway. By 10:30, I'd finished most of the patching and was cleaning up storage on a cluster of internal servers, older ones that hadn't been properly maintained in years. They weren't connected to anything external, just used for internal archiving and some classified telemetry tools I didn't have access to. The directories were a mess. Nested folders, mislabeled logs, duplicates of duplicates. I deleted unnecessary stuff, sorted the rest, and prepared to push the cleanup report. Nothing unusual. Then I noticed a folder I hadn't seen before. It was sitting at the bottom of the directory, slightly indented like it had been made by a system process instead of a user. No owner tag. No creation time, just a name, 2039-714. The date was decades ahead, far beyond any scheduled project timelines I knew about. I frowned, hovered my mouse over it, and waited for metadata. Nothing came up. The little info box that should have shown size, path, permissions, it didn't appear. I tried to right-click, no menu opened. Sometimes corrupted directories behave like that, so I attempted a command line query. The terminal acknowledged the folder path existed, but when I tried to list its contents, the cursor just froze mid-blink. I heard something then, a faint tapping behind me, like someone tapping a pen or finger against metal. I turned around. The server rack stood still, fans humming in their steady rhythm. Nobody else was in the room. I shook it off and tried again. This time, I attempted to open the folder using a root-level script. As soon as I hit enter, the monitor flickered. Not a glitch, more like a deliberate blackout, screen going flat gray, then pausing long enough for me to hear my own breathing. Then the workstation locked itself. A message appeared. Unauthorized access detected. Session terminated. I hadn't triggered anything like that before. That type of lockout usually only happened on systems with active surveillance protocols, and this server cluster wasn't one of them. Before I could touch the keyboard, the machine rebooted. Full restart. All processes terminated. Fans ramping up. BIOS check cycling. I sat there with my hands in my lap waiting for the login screen, trying to decide if I should report it immediately or pretend the system crashed. When the login prompt finally appeared, everything looked normal. The only strange thing was how warm the keyboard felt, like someone had held their palms over it. I logged in again, navigated back into the same directory tree, and scrolled to the bottom. The folder wasn't there, not grayed out, not hidden, not renamed. Gone. I checked the command log. Nothing showed any trace of it. No entry for the folder. No command attempts. No lockout message. It was as if the last 10 minutes hadn't happened. I checked system events. The logs had a timestamp gap. About 30 seconds unaccounted for. Not long. Just enough to erase a few actions. I reopened the terminal and tried the path manually. CD archive internal/2039-0714. The terminal responded, no such file or directory. I tried again with variations, same answer. The tapping started again behind me. Faint, rhythmic, like a slow tick on metal. I turned, expecting maybe a loose fan blade. Everything looked normal. Racks steady, lights steady, noise floor the same low hum. For a moment I stood there listening. The tapping had no direction to it. It didn't seem to come from one rack or one corner. It sounded like it traveled through the room's metal frame, moving in short bursts. Then it stopped. I got back to work, or at least pretended to. My hands were shaking more than I wanted to admit. I ran diagnostics on the server, checking for corruption. Everything passed perfectly. Every directory except that one existed exactly as it should. Around 11:20, a security officer named Ramirez stepped into the doorway. "You still here?" he asked. "Finishing up," I said. "You good?" His eyes flicked to the monitor, then to the racks. "Yeah, just tired," he nodded slowly. "Let me know when you're done. Gotta lock the wing." He walked out. His footsteps echoed down the hall, stopping at the security door before the latch clicked shut. I stared at the empty directory tree again. I didn't know if I imagined the folder, but I hadn't imagined the lockout, or the reboot, or the missing logs. I copied the current system state to my encrypted drive, just standard practice, and logged out. As I was packing up, the overhead lights flickered briefly. Not unusual for an old building, but the flicker wasn't a power dip. It was too uniform, almost like the lights dimmed in sequence along the hallway outside. Then silence. I left the room, locking the cabinet behind me. The hallway was colder than before, enough that I felt it through my shirt. My boots echoed strangely, louder than they should have in that narrow corridor. Ramirez walked me to the exit. He always did when contractors stayed late. He didn't ask any more questions, but every few steps he glanced at me, like he was waiting for me to say something. I didn't. Outside, the night was sharp and quiet. The stars were pale behind thin clouds rolling in from the northwest. I drove home with the radio off, trying not to think about the dates stamped on that folder. The next morning, I checked my notes and backup logs. Nothing from the previous night showed anything unusual. Even the small timestamp gap had been auto-corrected, filled with a boilerplate entry about routine indexing. My encrypted backup contained no trace of the folder either. But something else was off. The system clock on my work laptop had shifted forward by 1 minute. Not a big deal. Probably nothing, except it had never drifted before. That morning, I asked one of the base IT leads, casually, if they ever used future-dated project folders for long-term planning archives. He stared at me for a moment too long before answering. "No," he said. "Nothing would be labeled with a date that far ahead." I didn't bring it up again, but every time I log into a server now, I think about the folder, the way it appeared out of nowhere, the way the system responded before I could open it, the way it erased itself completely, including the part of the night where I tried to access it. I don't know what was inside. I only know something didn't want me to see it. I started my patrol just after 11 p.m., the same way I had most nights that month, checking the outer fence line along the South Access Road. It was one of those cold desert nights where the temperature drops hard after sunset, and the air feels hollow. The moon was thin, barely lighting the sand, and the wind kept coming in short bursts that rattled the chain link. Most shifts out there were quiet. You sat in your truck, drove the perimeter, logged each checkpoint, and tried not to think too much about how empty the desert looked at night. Lights from the main base sat far off in the distance, flickering like a mirage. Everything else was darkness. I was about halfway through the northern loop when I saw the first flicker of light in the sand. At first, I thought it was a reflection from my headlights hitting a piece of trash or buried glass, but the light wasn't on the surface. It was underneath. A soft, pale glow, maybe a foot or two below the ground. It moved like a slow ripple, sliding under the desert floor. I let the truck idle forward another few feet. The glow moved with me. Not fast, just steady, like something drifting in water. I rolled the window down to listen. The desert was quiet except for the faint hum of the engine. No drilling sounds, no machinery, no vibrations under the tires. If the glow hadn't been visible, I would have thought nothing was there. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out, keeping one hand on the door. The sand crunched under my boots. The glow held steady, then shifted slightly to the right, as if adjusting its course. I shined the flashlight directly at the ground. The beam didn't change anything. The glow stayed faint and diffuse, just a hazy white shape drifting under the sand. No edges, no clear form, nothing to suggest depth or size, just a moving patch of light. I crouched closer, my breath fogging in the cold. The glow paused, completely still. I felt the hair on my arms lift. I stood and backed toward the truck, watching it. When I opened the door, the glow moved again, matching the slow roll of my truck as I eased forward along the fence line. That was the moment it stopped being interesting and started feeling wrong. I drove a little faster. The glow kept up easily. It stayed parallel to me, maybe 15 or 20 feet off the fence, drifting along the sand at the exact pace of my vehicle. If I slowed to a crawl, it slowed. If I sped up, it brightened a little, as if straining to keep pace. I didn't radio it in right away. I didn't even know how to describe it without sounding like I was losing it. There were no protocols for unexpected glowing thing beneath the desert. After nearly a mile of it keeping pace, I took a sharp turn at a junction point. The glow hesitated at the corner, a strange pause, like it had to realign itself, then continued following the new direction. That's when I finally picked up the radio. Control, this is Patrol 3. I'm seeing something moving along the outer fence, possible underground utilities issue. Control asked me to clarify. I've got a light source under the surface, I said, trying to keep my voice level, tracking parallel to my vehicle. There was a long silence. Finally, Patrol 3, confirm if this is a visible external light source. Negative, I said. It's below ground. Another silence. Longer. Copy. Continue observation. Do not engage. As if I was going to dig into the sand to check, the glow kept sliding along. Sometimes it dimmed, almost fading out entirely before brightening again. I could never see a definite shape, just that soft halo of light, always moving, always keeping the same distance from me. About a quarter mile from the next checkpoint, the glow abruptly veered away from the fence line. It drifted deeper into the open desert, slow at first, then faster. The brightness pulsed as it moved, like it was picking up speed underground. I stopped the truck and watched it go. The glow traveled in a straight line toward a low ridge, then faded entirely before reaching it. No flicker, no dimming, just gone, like something switched it off. I waited a few minutes, scanning the desert. Nothing else appeared. Just winds stirring loose sand. Control asked for an update. Object disappeared, I said. Southwest direction, last seen about 50 yards out. Any surface disturbance? Negative. Return to standard patrol. I finished the loop, but every time my headlights swept across the desert, I felt like I would see that glow start up again, moving just beneath the surface like some quiet thing burrowing in the dark. The next morning, the ground team did a scan of that entire section. Thermal imaging, seismic sensors, utility checks, everything. I tagged along even though I wasn't required to. We found nothing. No tunnels, No temperature pockets, no buried wires out of place, no evidence the sand had ever been disturbed. The seismic readings were dead flat, no sign of movement from the previous night. The tech running the equipment, a guy named Sutton, shook his head at me. "You said it was moving underground?" he asked. "That's what it looked like." Well, nothing moved down there. We walked the full mile of the fence line where I'd seen it. I kept expecting to spot something I'd missed, an animal burrow, a reflection from equipment, anything. But the sand was smooth, undisturbed, cold from the night air. When Sutton finished the last scan, he said, "If something was tunneling, we'd see density shifts. But everything's clean." He paused, then added, "You sure it wasn't headlights from the road reflecting through dust? Happens sometimes." "There's no road on that side," I said. He didn't reply. For the next few shifts, I found myself watching the sand more than the fence. Every bump of the truck, every shadow, every trick of moonlight felt suspicious. But nothing appeared again. No glow, no movement, no sign of anything below. Just desert. But the way that light followed my truck, steady, deliberate, like it was aware of me, still sits in my mind. There's no training manual for that. No line in the security briefing that says what to do when something underground matches your speed for a mile. Whatever it was, the desert hid it well by daylight. Too well. I was surveying land just east of Groom Lake, maybe 6 miles outside the restricted boundary, where the public land still looks untouched if you ignore the distant warning signs. It was late morning, already hot enough that the metal on my tripod burned my fingers if I didn't wear gloves. The sky was clear but washed out, the kind of pale blue that makes the desert feel bigger than it really is. I was mapping incremental elevations for a private contractor. Not government work, not base-related, just a job for some environmental impact study. I'd been out there all week, hiking between flag points, setting up my gear, marking coordinates. Everything had gone smoothly until I reached a small basin near the edge of a dried creek bed. The patch of ground didn't look like anything special. Just low scrub, hardpan soil, a few scattered rocks bleached almost white from sun exposure. I dropped my pack, set up my tripod, and pulled out my compass to confirm orientation. The needle spun. Not in a lazy drift the way it does when you're near metal, and not in a shaky off-north wobble from interference. It spun in a full circle, fast, like something beneath the ground was pulling it around. I lifted it higher. The needle steadied, pointing north like normal. I lowered it again toward the ground. Spin. I checked my pockets, no magnets. I checked the tripod, aluminum, nothing magnetic. I checked my radio, my GPS unit, even the metal buttons on my shirt. Nothing should have caused that kind of behavior. I stepped back a few feet. The needle steadied again. I stepped forward into the same area. Spin. I remember staring at that patch of dirt, trying to figure out what made that spot any different from the rest of the basin. No discoloration, no debris, no vegetation cluster, just perfectly plain ground acting like it had a magnet buried beneath it. Except nothing that strong would affect my compass, only within a tight 5-foot radius. I pulled out my handheld GPS to double-check coordinates. The screen flickered. Battery icon dropped from full to half. Then it shut off completely. I smacked it, thinking maybe the heat was messing with the display, but when I popped the battery cover, the pack was still cool. No swelling, no smell, just dead. My radio crackled like someone was rubbing sandpaper against the mic. Then it cut out too. I tried my phone next. Same result. Battery went from 78% to 0 in less than 30 seconds. I backed out of the area, confused and now more annoyed than anything. As soon as I stepped several feet away, my radio clicked back on like nothing had happened. My phone restarted normally. The GPS booted without complaint, showing a normal battery level again. I walked back toward the patch. Everything dropped dead the second I crossed into that invisible circle. That's when the silence kicked in. Not absence of wind or animal noise, but the desert felt muffled. The air got still in a way I can't explain, like standing in a sound booth. I didn't stay long. I packed my gear and marked the spot on paper since I didn't trust anything electronic near it. I'd been doing surveys long enough to know weird anomalies happen. Ferrous deposits, stray electromagnetic fields, even underground cables can cause compass drift. But whatever was under that ground behaved too precisely, too deliberately. A perfect boundary, a perfect zone. I finished the rest of my mapping quickly. I kept glancing back toward that patch, expecting, I don't know, movement, light, something breaking the surface. Nothing happened. Just the memory of all my devices going dead inside that circle. I went home thinking I'd come back the next week with better equipment. A more sensitive magnetometer, maybe a fresh battery pack, maybe another surveyor to verify I wasn't losing my mind. 7 days later, I returned. The patch was gone. The whole basin, maybe an acre, had been freshly graded flat. Not smoothed by wind or runoff, mechanically flattened. Every rock removed, every natural depression filled. The soil looked compacted, uniform, wrong, like a parking lot made of dirt. My marker flags were gone too. The ones I'd left 50 yards away weren't just knocked over, they were missing entirely, as if someone collected them. I stood there for a long time, waiting for some kind of sound, machinery, vehicles, even distant activity from the base. But the desert was quiet. No tire tracks, no footprints. Whoever graded that land had done it with industrial-level thoroughness and erased every sign of their presence. I walked the entire perimeter, hoping I'd misremembered the location. Maybe I was off by 100 feet. Maybe erosion made the area look different. But the ridge shapes matched my map. The dry wash ran exactly where it had before. The alignment of boulders along the hillside was the same. This was the spot. It was just wiped clean. I stepped onto the freshly leveled ground. My boots left clear prints. The dirt was soft, recently turned over. I pulled out my compass again. Steady north. No spin. I walked to the center of where the anomaly had been. The ground was flat and silent. I tried my GPS. Full battery, no flicker. I turned on my radio. Clear channel. I stood there longer than I should have, shifting my feet, half expecting the compass needle to snap into a spin, or my phone to die instantly, or the air to drop into that strange muffled quiet again. None of it happened. The more normal everything was, the more wrong it felt. Who had come out here? Why that specific spot? And how did they know to grade it within a week of me discovering it? On my way back to the truck, I noticed something else. The graded area wasn't perfectly level. It had a slight dip at its center. Subtle, but visible if you knew what the terrain used to look like. Almost like whoever did the clearing wasn't just erasing something, they were covering something. I never filed a report. I wasn't officially working on anything that involved the base, and drawing attention to it would have done nothing except get me pulled from future contracts. But I marked the location on my paper map, circled it twice, then folded it into my glove compartment. Every now and then, when my work takes me near that area again, I drive by. The basin still looks unnaturally smooth. Too smooth for desert wind, too smooth for runoff, too smooth for nature. But when I check the dirt with my compass now, the needle behaves exactly the way it should, which almost makes it worse. Because something changed that land, and it wasn't the weather. I was flying my Cherokee back from a supply hop to Tonopah when I saw it. The sun had just dipped behind the mountains, that short window where everything turns orange and you lose depth perception for a few minutes. The winds were rougher than forecast. Steady crosswind from the south, maybe 25 knots, enough that I had to fight the yoke just to keep level. I was about 40 miles west of Groom Lake airspace, still legal, still civilian. I'd flown the route dozens of times, usually uneventful. Nothing but desert, dry lake beds, and the long stretch of Highway 375 cutting through nowhere. Then, out of the corner of my eye, something caught the dying sunlight, except it didn't actually reflect anything. It just appeared as a darker patch against the sky, matte black, no shine, no edges catching the light. At first I thought it was a bird, maybe close enough to look bigger than it was. But as I glanced again, I realized it wasn't moving at all, just hanging there, perfectly still. At my altitude, with the wind the way it was, nothing should have been motionless. Not balloons, not drones, nothing. I steadied the plane and watched it for a second. The longer I looked, the more wrong it seemed. It didn't have a recognizable shape, more like a stretched oval, maybe 20 or 30 feet across, but the edges were hard to define. My eyes kept wanting to give it detail that wasn't there. I checked my instruments out of habit, altimeter steady, heading steady, no alerts. Then I looked at the portable ADS-B display clipped to the panel. Nothing, no traffic, no restricted advisories, no blip that could have been the object. That wasn't impossible. Plenty of aircraft didn't broadcast on civilian frequencies. But even stealth aircraft usually showed something if they were close enough. This thing was maybe half a mile off my right wing. I keyed my mic. Niner 1 Bravo to Albuquerque Center. Do you have any traffic east of my position? A few seconds of static, then Niner 1 Bravo. Negative. You are the only aircraft in that corridor. My stomach tightened. I banked slightly to the right, just a gentle turn to get a better angle. The object wasn't far below me, but not at my altitude either. Maybe a couple 100 feet beneath, hanging above a broad stretch of sand. As my nose swung toward it, the thing reacted. Not fast, not dramatic. It just tilted, like it was turning to face me, except it didn't rotate like an aircraft would. The whole body seemed to shift orientation smoothly, without pivot points, without wings or tail or anything fixed. I felt a jolt of adrenaline hit my chest. I didn't bank any further. I leveled off and kept distance, hands tight on the yoke. Another glance at ADS-B, still nothing. Albuquerque Center, confirming no restricted ops ahead? I asked, trying to keep my voice even. Affirmative, 1 Bravo, all clear, maintain heading. The matte black shape held still again, matching my direction, like it was observing. I'd never felt watched from the outside of my cockpit before. Not by another aircraft, not even by military traffic. This was different, hard to describe, just a feeling that it was paying attention. The wind buffeted the plane again, jolting the wings. My Cherokee pitched slightly before I corrected. The air was rough enough that anything suspended should have drifted or bobbed, but the object stayed fixed in place. No sway, no dip, no compensation, just perfect stillness. The last few rays of sunlight hit the desert floor, lighting the ground orange, but the object absorbed light instead of reflecting it, like a hole cut into the sky. I banked left to put some distance between us. Not a sharp turn, just enough to signal I wasn't approaching. The object didn't move for several seconds, then it rose, straight up, no acceleration curve, no visible thrust, no dust disturbed beneath it, no sound through my headset, no rumble through the airframe. One moment it hovered, the next moment it was dozens of feet higher. The next, hundreds, like a perfectly vertical elevator made of air. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe the dim light was messing with my depth perception. But the object continued rising, smooth, steady, impossible. At maybe 1,000 feet above its starting point, it paused again. The sunlight had nearly faded. The sky shifted toward dark blue. The object blended with the coming night, hard to track even when it was right in front of me. I forced myself to look away long enough to check my instruments again. Still nothing. My radio clicked suddenly, just a tiny burst of static, not unusual in rough terrain. But then I heard a faint tone in my headset, like 2 notes layered over each other. Not a voice, not interference I recognized. A sound that felt patterned, but not intentional. I tapped the side of the headset. Center, 1 Bravo. Radio check? Loud and clear, 1 Bravo. The tone cut out. I looked back toward the object. It had risen even higher, so high that I had to angle my neck to see it above the canopy. I banked away more sharply now, putting distance between us. I didn't care if it looked unprofessional. My heart was pounding. I wanted that thing out of sight. But before it vanished into the dark sky, it did one last thing. It shifted orientation again, tilting toward me or toward the path of my plane, like it was adjusting its attention. And then, without warning, it shot upward. Not fast like a jet, not streaking like a missile, just upward until it dissolved into the darkening sky. No trail, no light, no signature. Gone. I flew the rest of the route without speaking. My radio stayed clear. My instruments behaved normally. The winds eased as night took over, and everything went quiet in that eerie way the desert does after sunset. When I landed at the small airstrip back home, I asked the guy in the hangar, Tom, who'd been monitoring local traffic, whether he'd seen anything unusual. Nothing, he said. You were the only one up there. What about blips? Any radar anomalies? He shook his head. I thought about mentioning it, but stopped. I didn't have the right words. Nothing about what I saw fit anything that should have been in that airspace, civilian or military. Later that night, when I checked my GPS logs, I noticed a tiny gap, less than a second, during the moment the object rose vertically. A missing timestamp. Not enough to mean anything. Not enough to prove anything. But enough for me to notice. I kept replaying the way it faced me before it ascended. That slow, deliberate tilt. Like it recognized my presence. I've flown that route many times since. Same desert, same mountains, same dusk light, if I hit it right. I never saw anything like that again. But every time I pass the spot where it hovered, I feel myself tense without meaning to, waiting. I was parked at one of those gravel pullouts along Highway 375, the kind with a faded sign and nothing else around for miles. It was early spring, cold enough that the wind came off the desert like a blade. I'd been driving all afternoon and stopped mostly to stretch my legs and check the map before losing cell service again. A couple of RVs were parked farther down, but nobody else seemed to be outside. The sky was that deep blue you get right after sunset, when you can still see the outline of everything, but the stars are already pushing through. I leaned against my car, drinking the last of my gas station coffee, when I noticed a white light moving across the sky. At first I assumed it was a plane. This stretch of Nevada has flight paths all over it, but then it changed direction, fast, at a sharp angle that didn't look right. Not a curve, not a banking turn, just a clean pivot, like it bounced off an invisible wall. I lowered the coffee cup and squinted. The light didn't blink. Not once. Airplanes all blink. Even high-altitude jets give some kind of pulse. I watched it cross a long horizontal stretch before it cut upward in a straight vertical line. Another instant change in direction that didn't match anything I'd seen in the sky before. Planes can't do that. Drones don't do that either, not at that speed or altitude. I checked the RVs down the road. No one else seemed to be looking. The light slowed, then stopped, just hung there. A single white point in the sky, brighter than any star and completely silent. I waited for engine noise, but there was nothing. The wind rustled the sagebrush, a low scrape along the ground, but the air above me stayed empty and quiet. The light didn't flicker, drift, or adjust, just hovered. A full minute passed. I know because I looked at the clock on my dashboard without thinking. 60 seconds of nothing happening and everything feeling wrong. I kept telling myself it had to be something explainable. Military test flight, maybe, using thrust vectoring or who knows what. But the longer it hovered, the less it lined up with anything I could rationalize. Then it moved again. Not in a smooth acceleration. It snapped sideways, another clean angle, like someone dragged it across the sky with a ruler. It didn't leave a trail, it didn't streak, it didn't blur. It just appeared in a slightly different spot, same brightness, same stillness. I realized then how cold my hands felt, even though I was still wearing gloves. The wind picked up a little, pushing grit across the road. The light didn't respond, didn't wobble, didn't shift. Like wind didn't apply to it at all. I climbed onto the hood of my car to get a better angle. The metal was freezing. The light held steady, then it dimmed, not gradually like a star behind a cloud, but instantly, like someone turned a dial, from bright to muted. It stayed visible at half power for maybe 2 seconds. Then it vanished, not by moving away or blinking off. It just ceased to exist in the space it had occupied. No trail, no afterglow, just empty sky where a moment ago something had been hovering. I stayed sitting on the hood long after it disappeared. The wind felt louder without anything to focus on. My heartbeat felt too heavy in my chest. I kept scanning the sky, waiting for it to come back. Nothing returned. I thought maybe the RV folks had seen it too, so I drove down the pullout and stopped near one of them. A man stepped out, bundled up in a heavy jacket. "Everything all right?" he asked. "You didn't see that light?" I said. "What light?" He looked around like he expected to see a helicopter or maybe headlights. "Right above the ridge," I said, pointing. "It was zigzagging, hovering." He shook his head. "We just got here, haven't been outside." I didn't have anything else to say. I got back in my car and sat for a while with the engine running, heater going full blast. The sky had finally gone black, dotted with stars. Every so often, I thought I saw movement, but it always turned out to be a plane or a satellite or my eyes adjusting. I drove away eventually, but even on the highway, I kept checking my mirrors and glancing at the sky through the windshield. The strangest part was how quiet everything had felt while the light hovered there, like the desert was holding its breath. As soon as it vanished, the normal sounds came back. The wind pushing against the car, loose sand skittering across the road, the low hum of my own engine. It almost made me doubt what I saw. Almost. But I can still picture that white point of light, perfectly steady against a sky that should have made it drift or shimmer. and the way it dimmed out in an instant without moving an inch. I was halfway through my night shift when the first alert pinged through my tablet. It was close to 11 p.m., cold enough that my breath fogged inside the cab of the utility truck. I'd been contracted to service perimeter sensors around the base. Nothing complicated, mostly recalibrations and swapping out dying batteries. The system usually behaved. False alarms were rare. This alert came from a dry lake bed about 4 miles outside the restricted zone, completely empty land, no structures, no wildlife larger than jackrabbits, definitely no people. The tablet showed, motion detected, sector H37. I zoomed in on the sensor map. The marker blinked twice, then went still. No movement, no follow-up alerts. Probably a glitch, I thought. Desert winds sometimes kicked sand high enough to confuse the older sensors. I logged the occurrence anyway, then tried to move on. 20 minutes later, it pinged again. Same location, same brief motion detection, same immediate silence afterward. I sighed, packed up my gear, and headed toward the lake bed. Even with the engine running, the desert felt unusually quiet. No coyotes in the distance. No rustle from the brush, just the hum of tires over gravel. The lake bed was a dull gray under the moon, flat as a tabletop. I parked at the flagged coordinates and got out, boots crunching in the cold sand. Nothing moved. Not a shadow. Not even wind. I checked the sensor housing. Everything looked normal. No loose wires, no temperature spikes, no sand intrusion. I recalibrated it just to be safe. Before heading back, I walked the area with my flashlight. That's when I noticed the ground. A patch about 15 feet across felt warmer than the rest. Not hot, just faintly warm, like it had absorbed afternoon heat even though the temperature had dropped below freezing. I crouched down and ran my glove over the surface. The warmth wasn't consistent across the patch. It was strongest near the center, fading out toward the edges. The rest of the lake bed felt icy. I checked my tablet again to see if the sensor caught anything while I was standing there. No alerts. I drove back to the access road, chalking it up to weird ground insulation or leftover heat stored in the clay. Desert terrain does strange things. I'd convinced myself of that many times. But an hour later, the alerts came back, 3 times in a row, quick bursts, like something was moving rapidly across the sensor's field and then vanishing. I drove out a second time, grumbling the whole way. Night shifts already had a way of stretching time thin, and chasing ghost alerts wasn't helping. As I approached the lake bed, the alerts stopped, just went silent, no blinking marker, no motion logs. When I reached the same spot, the warm patch was there again. This time it felt slightly hotter than before, enough that I could sense the difference even through my boots. I pointed my thermal scanner at it. The display flickered for half a second, then returned to flat reading, ambient temperature. But I knew it wasn't ambient. My own hands felt the difference. I knelt down and held my palm an inch from the surface. The warmth was unmistakable. The desert air around me was freezing. My breath hung in front of my face. The sand 5 feet away felt like ice. But this patch was warm. I didn't touch it barehanded. I don't know why. I just had a feeling I shouldn't. Back in the truck, I typed a maintenance note without explaining too much. Contractors didn't ask questions. Questions made paperwork. At around 2 a.m., the alerts started again, shorter this time, almost like pulses. I stared at the tablet, watching the motion indicator blink on and off, without pattern. The blinking set my teeth on edge. I didn't want to go back out again. The spot had started to bother me in a way I couldn't articulate. Too empty, too quiet, too intentional in how the alerts stopped exactly when I arrived. But it was my job. I clicked the headlights to full beam, drove back into the lakebed dust, and watched the same pattern happen again. The second my truck got within about 200 yards, the alerts stopped. Dead quiet. My tires crunched to a stop on the cracked clay. I stepped out and swept the area with my flashlight. Still nothing. But when I walked toward the warm patch, now familiar enough that I could find it even in dim light, I noticed something different. The warmth wasn't just on the surface anymore. It radiated upward slightly, like there was a heat source deeper underground. Just faint, like someone had buried a low-wattage heater beneath the soil. I stood there listening. A low vibration rippled through the ground. Barely noticeable, more sensation than sound. It came in a single pulse, like a heartbeat felt through the earth. I froze, hand tightening around the flashlight. The vibration didn't repeat. The patch cooled by a degree or two, enough for me to feel it fade. I backed away slowly. When I returned to the truck, I logged the area as possibly thermally active from an unknown source. I didn't elaborate. By 4 a.m., I'd finished my other checks and headed home. Before I left, curiosity got the better of me, and I checked the sensor logs from earlier shifts that month. The same lakebed had triggered random alerts at least 9 times over 2 weeks. Always brief, always motion, always unverified, and always occurring late at night. I returned the following Thursday with a colleague, Henry, who was covering day shift. He was skeptical but polite when I asked him to come out and verify the readings. We drove to the lakebed under the full sun. Heat shimmered off the sand. Lizards darted between rocks. Everything felt normal. Too normal. We walked the perimeter. The sensor behaved perfectly. No alerts, no false readings. The ground temperature matched what it should have been at midday. The warm patch, gone. Not cooler, not warm. Just the same as the rest of the lakebed. Even stranger, a thin layer of fresh, wind-smoothed sand covered the area, as if nature had erased anything unusual. I crouched where the patch had been and touched the ground. Cold, hard, featureless. Henry looked at me like maybe I'd misread something the night before. He said, "You sure it wasn't leftover heat from the sun?" I didn't answer. Because standing there in broad daylight, with everything looking perfectly ordinary, I couldn't prove any of it had happened. The warm ground, the pulsing alerts, the strange vibration underfoot. But that night, when I reviewed my manual logs again, something new stood out. The sensor had triggered one more time after I left the lakebed. A single alert. Motion detected, sector H37. Exactly 2 minutes after I'd driven away. No follow-up, no anomaly, no explanation. Just that one quiet ping in the middle of the empty desert. And whatever caused it never showed itself when I was there. Only before I arrived, and only after I left. The aircraft rolled into Bay 3 just after midnight, still warm from whatever flight it had been on. I didn't recognize the tail number, but that wasn't unusual out there. Half the stuff I worked on didn't officially exist. What caught my attention first was how quiet it was when the engines powered down. Usually there's a ticking, some kind of thermal contraction, but this one settled into silence like it hadn't been running at all. My supervisor, Keating, handed me the inspection checklist and said, "Quick turnaround, just the basics." That usually meant don't ask questions. I grabbed my light and started circling the aircraft. The hangar was cold enough that my breath came out cloudy. There was a faint humming from the generators, but otherwise it felt too quiet for how big the space was. When I got to the landing gear, I noticed something strange. Fine dust clung to the tire grooves and lower struts, a sort of dusty coating, but not like the tan grit you normally get from the desert. This stuff looked darker, almost gray-silver, and it caught the beam of my flashlight in this weird way. Not sparkling, exactly, but shimmering, like someone mixed metal shavings with powder. I rubbed some between my fingers. It felt dry, finer than sand, almost soft. When I held my fingers closer to the light, it reflected in a dull metallic sheen. I'd never seen desert dust do that. I scraped a small amount into one of my sample vials. Normally, I wouldn't bother collecting debris from landing gear, but something about this felt out of place. The texture, the color, the way it stuck to the metal without static. The rest of the inspection was uneventful. Panels intact, no leaks, no thermal warping. Everything about the aircraft looked spotless, which was odd considering the amount of dust on the wheels. When I climbed up to check the wheel wells, I saw more of the same dust sprinkled across the inner struts. Not heavy, but noticeable. The wells should have been clean if the aircraft had come in on a paved strip, unless it had landed somewhere else first. That wasn't my business, though, so I didn't dwell on it. By the time I finished the checklist and signed off the initial report, it was almost 1 a.m. The hangar felt colder than before, like the big doors were leaking air. I grabbed my toolbox and headed toward the small break room to label the vial properly. Inside, the lights flickered once, just a quick pulse. Old ballast problem, nothing unusual. I set the toolbox on the counter, opened it, and reached in for the vial. It wasn't there. I checked the side pocket, the front compartment, under the rags, even the bottom tray where I keep spare fuses. Nothing. I emptied the whole box onto the counter, No vial. I stood there staring at the mess of tools, trying to remember if I'd left it somewhere by the aircraft. But I specifically remembered dropping it into the little interior slot, the one I always used for small parts so they wouldn't roll. I repacked the toolbox and went back out into the hangar. The aircraft sat there quietly, like it had been waiting. My flashlight beam cut across the concrete floor. No footprints except my own, no dust trails, no glimmer from the metallic powder I'd collected. I checked under the wheel chocks in case I'd set the vial down accidentally. Nothing. I even checked the pocket of my coveralls, though I already knew it wouldn't be there. I walked back to the break room telling myself I'd just misplaced it. But something felt off. An uneasy pressure in my chest, like I was supposed to notice the absence. I decided to gather another sample before the cleaning crew came in. When I reached the landing gear again, the dust was gone. Completely gone. Not smeared, not displaced, just absent. The tires looked normal, the struts clean. I crouched down and touched the rubber. Cold, dry, nothing on my gloves. I climbed up to check the wheel wells. Same thing. Clean metal, no residue, like someone had wiped everything down thoroughly while I was in the break room. But I hadn't heard anything. No footsteps, no equipment moving, no rolling carts. The hangar had been silent. When I checked the maintenance logs again, the glow from the monitor cast long shadows across the bay. I kept glancing toward the aircraft as I typed. It sat there like a dark shape that didn't want to be looked at too long. Keating walked in a few minutes later, rubbing his eyes like he'd just woken from a nap. "You finish inspection?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "But I found some kind of dust on the landing gear, metallic looking. It wasn't on the checklist." He didn't react, didn't ask about it, just nodded once. "It's clean now," he said. "Make sure your report stays standard." I frowned. "Did someone come wipe it down?" "No," he said too quickly. "You must have seen dried hydraulic residue." "It wasn't fluid," I said. "It was standard," he repeated, sharper this time. I didn't argue. Not there. Not with the aircraft sitting behind him in the corner of my eye. When he left, I finished typing the clean report. No anomalies, no foreign debris, no irregular dust accumulation. Before heading out, I checked my toolbox one more time. Everything was where it should be, except the missing vial. That spot was empty, as if nothing had ever been placed there. I walked out of the hangar into the cold desert night. The sky was clear, stars scattered across it. The moonlight barely touched the outline of the mountains. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been quietly corrected behind me, like a mistake erased before anyone else could notice. In the morning, I asked Keating again whether anyone else had been assigned to Bay 3. "No," he said. "The aircraft's already gone." I checked the tarmac through the windows. The bay was empty. No markings, no sign an aircraft had even been moved. That night, before the next shift, I opened my toolbox again. Part of me hoped the vial had somehow reappeared. It hadn't, just the faintest hint of a metallic smell that faded the moment I noticed it. We were camped maybe 3 miles from the outer boundary fence, at one of those unofficial pull-off spots people use when they don't want to pay for a campground. It was early fall, desert nights already getting cold. There were 4 of us, me, my friend Lucas, and a couple we'd met earlier that day, Maria and her brother Jonah. We weren't doing anything wild, just grilled some food, had a couple beers, and sat around talking until we all started getting tired. I went into my tent around midnight. The others stayed up a bit longer, but by 1:30 the whole camp was quiet. The air smelled like dust and the leftover smoke from the little fire we'd put out. The sky was clear, really clear, the way it only gets out in that part of Nevada. You could see every star. I must have been asleep for 30, maybe 40 minutes when I felt the ground vibrate. Not a jolt, not shaking, more like a long, steady hum, almost like a big truck idling underground. It wasn't loud. It was subtle enough that I thought it might be part of my dream at first. But when I opened my eyes, the tent fabric was trembling just slightly, like someone was running a hand across it from the outside. Then, almost at the exact same second, all 3 car alarms went off. Mine, Lucas's, and the rental Jonah had brought. They didn't go into full alarm, more like a single chirp, the kind that usually means the doors were locked or unlocked remotely, except nobody had touched anything. I sat up fast. I heard the zipper of another tent, then Jonah whispering, Did you guys feel that? Lucas answered, Yeah, something's vibrating. The ground gave another pulse, not stronger, just more definite, like it was making sure we noticed this time. I stepped out into the cold and saw the others doing the same. The air felt still, too still for the desert at night. No wind, no insects, no distant highway noise. All three cars had their parking lights flicker once before shutting off again. Could be a quake, Maria said, but she didn't sound convinced. There was no follow-up tremor, no shifting dirt, nothing that felt like natural movement. We all looked toward the fence line, even though it was too far away to see from where we were. Mostly, I think we wanted to make sure nothing was coming. When I tilted my head back, I noticed something in the sky. It wasn't a light, exactly. More like a dim, circular glow way higher than anything should have been glowing. Not bright enough to illuminate anything on the ground, but bright enough to look wrong. A vague, uneven ring, like the afterimage you get from staring at a flashlight, except it stayed perfectly still. Is that a cloud? Lucas asked. There aren't any clouds, I said. He was right about the shape. It looked like a cloud lit from behind. But the sky was empty. Stars everywhere except inside that faint circle. Inside it, the stars were muted, not gone, but dimmer somehow. We stood there watching it, nobody saying anything for a long time. The ground vibration continued at this slow, constant frequency. Not painful, not even uncomfortable, just this low humming that made my teeth feel like they wanted to buzz. Then it stopped, completely. The silence afterward felt heavier, like the air was waiting for something. The circle of light flickered once. It didn't brighten or dim, it just pulsed, like someone tapping a light switch too quickly to fully shut it off. Then it stayed steady again, hovering above us without moving. Jonah muttered, "What the hell is that?" None of us answered. We didn't have anything to compare it to. It wasn't a plane, it wasn't a drone, it wasn't a spotlight. There were no beams, no sound, no movement. After maybe another minute, the circle began fading, not shrinking, just losing brightness, like someone slowly lowered the exposure on a camera. The stars inside it came back into focus. The edges dissolved into the rest of the sky. Then it was gone, like it had never been there. We kept standing outside, trying to see if it would come back. It didn't. Everything stayed silent. Even the cars stayed quiet. Eventually, Lucas said he was going back to bed. Nobody argued. We were too tired and too unsure what else to do. But none of us slept well after that. I woke up 2 more times during the night, checking the sky through the mesh of my tent. Nothing. Just stars. When the sun came up, we walked around the camp looking for anything unusual. No footprints that weren't ours. No disturbed dirt. No marks on the cars. Nothing that would explain why all 3 alarms chirped at once. Before we packed up, I checked the car's diagnostic display. It showed a brief voltage spike at 2:04 a.m., the exact moment everything happened. Lucas's car had the same spike. The rental didn't have detailed diagnostics, but Jonah said the clock had reset itself to midnight. We talked about reporting it to someone, but who do you even call for something like that? It wasn't a crash. It wasn't a fire. It wasn't anything you could describe without sounding like you were making it up. When we drove off, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting the circle to reappear. It didn't. Everything looked normal in daylight. The same desert scrub, same empty sky, but I kept replaying the moment the ground stopped vibrating, that sudden stillness right before the glow faded. It felt almost like whatever caused it had moved on, and we were standing in the absence it left behind. We didn't camp that close to the boundary again. It started during my 3rd month on base, just before winter. I was on early shift that week, which meant waking up around 4:30 a.m. and walking across the east side of the property while the sky was still dark. Most mornings were the same, cold, quiet, and empty, except for the occasional truck heading toward the hangars. But one morning I stepped outside the dorms and noticed how loud the birds were. They always nested in the low scrub around that area, chirping nonstop in the hour before sunrise. This time, they were especially active, like something had stirred them up. I remember thinking it was almost comforting, the way the noise filled the whole place. Then, all at once, it stopped, not gradually fading, not shifting or relocating. Every bird in hearing range went silent in the same instant, like someone hit a mute button. I actually froze mid-step, unsure if I was imagining it. The air felt empty without that background noise. A second or two passed, and that's when I heard the humming. It came from the direction of the main hangars, low, steady, and too even to be machinery warming up. It didn't sound mechanical, not like generators or turbines. It wasn't a vibration through the ground either. More like a tone that hovered in the air, almost too low to register unless you focused on it. I stood there listening, trying to place it. The sound didn't grow louder or softer. It just held at one perfect pitch. Then, just as abruptly as the birds, it stopped. The silence that followed made my skin prickle. I waited another moment, half expecting it to resume, but nothing happened. Eventually, the birds started up again, scattered at first, then all at once, like someone had flipped a switch in reverse. I didn't tell anyone about it that day. It didn't seem like something worth mentioning. Old bases make weird noises. Animals react strangely sometimes. I brushed it off, but then it happened again 2 days later. Same time, right before dawn. Birds going completely silent in an instant, and that same steady humming coming from the hangars. This time it lasted longer, maybe 20 or 30 seconds. I tried to pinpoint the exact location, but the sound didn't echo or fade like normal noise. It just existed in the air, directionless but unmistakable. The moment it cut out, the birds started again. During breakfast, I asked another airman on my shift, Carter, if he'd noticed anything weird in the mornings. He shrugged. Sometimes they run tests before sunrise. What kind of tests? He just shrugged again. Stuff above our pay grade. That was the end of that conversation. A few days passed without anything unusual, and I figured it might have been equipment cycling at weird hours. But then it happened a third time. This one bothered me more than the others. I'd been outside earlier than usual because I'd woken up before my alarm. The sky had a faint blue tint, but the sun wasn't up yet. I remember thinking the air felt heavier than normal. Not humid, just weighted somehow. Once again, the birds were loud, and once again they went silent all at once. This time, though, the silence felt deeper, like the space around me changed somehow. I don't know how else to describe it. Just that sudden absence of sound felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. The hum started again from the direction of the hangars, but it wasn't the same pitch as before. It wavered slightly, almost like someone adjusting a frequency knob. It shifted up, then down, then settled on a tone lower than any mechanical drone I'd ever heard. I walked a few steps toward the fence line just to see if I could get a better angle. The hum didn't get louder. It didn't react to my movement at all. The sky above the hangars had this faint, washed-out look, like a thin layer of fog I couldn't quite see, just a subtle discoloration. Then the hum cut off so suddenly it almost hurt my ears. The birds stayed silent this time. 10, maybe 15 seconds passed before they started up again, one call at a time, hesitant at first. Their calls sounded sharper than usual, like they were still unsettled. That day I tried bringing it up to my supervisor, Sergeant Lyman. I didn't mention the birds, I figured that would make it sound too strange, but I told him about the humming. He didn't even look up from his paperwork. You probably heard a pressure test. At 4:30 in the morning, they run them when they need to. That was the end of that. For the next week, nothing happened. I even started waking up early on purpose, sitting outside just to see if I could catch it again. The mornings stayed normal. Birds chirping, trucks moving, lights flickering on in the distance. Then one morning, long after I'd stopped waiting for it, it returned. I'd been walking the back path behind the dorms, the one that cuts between two low ridges. Sunrise was about 20 minutes away, and the desert had that strange bluish glow right before daylight. Birds were chirping like always. Then silence fell across the entire ridge. Every bird, every insect. Even the wind seemed to stop pushing against the brush. The hum rose out of the quiet, louder than before. Not painfully loud, just more present, like it was closer or stronger. The pitch vibrated lightly in my ribs. I don't know if that was physical or just nerves. I stood still and tried to breathe normally. The hum stretched on longer than any previous time, at least 40 seconds, maybe more. It had that same steady quality, like it wasn't generated by anything physical, more like a tone in an empty room. Then, with no warning, it stopped. Not faded, not tapered off, stopped instantly. The same moment it ended, a floodlight near one of the hangars flicked on. even though it wasn't motion triggered. It stayed on for maybe 3 seconds, then shut off again. The birds didn't resume chirping for almost a full minute. When they finally did, the sound was weak at first, scattered and uneven. I didn't bring it up again after that. I didn't want another canned explanation. I figured if there was something happening, they already knew about it and didn't plan on telling us. The strange part is that it only ever happened before dawn. Never in the afternoon, never at night, never during training days or busy flight cycles. Just that narrow window before the sun broke the horizon. And each time the birds reacted first. Then the hum would come. Then everything would go still. Every so often, when I wake up early, even now, I listen for the sound without meaning to. Even far from the desert, there's a moment right before sunrise when the world gets quiet just for a breath, and I catch myself waiting for that hum. I was running a fuel load out toward one of the remote checkpoints west of the base. Same run I'd done a dozen times before. It was late afternoon in early summer, that time of day when the heat finally starts dropping, but the air still feels baked. The sky was clear, wind light, visibility perfect. I remember that because the job usually got weird only when the weather acted up. The dirt access road cut straight through a long stretch of empty land, then curved around a low ridge before dropping toward the checkpoint. I'd slowed down near the ridge because the gravel there was loose and the tanker liked to fishtail if I wasn't careful. That's when I saw movement on the far side of the ridge. At first I thought it was a dust devil forming, but there was no swirling dirt, no sudden gust, just something shifting in a smooth, controlled way. A dark shape sliding up the slope, almost like the crest of the ridge was rising. I eased off the accelerator. The tanker rumbled underneath me, but the movement on the ridge didn't match the vibration of the truck or the wind. It was too steady. It rose a little higher, maybe a foot or two above the ridgeline, enough to show a curved edge, smooth, perfectly rounded, nothing like the angular shapes of vehicles or structures. Then it sank back down. No dust kicked up, no rocks dislodged, no sound. I waited a few seconds, watching the ridge. Nothing else moved. The desert went still again. I told myself it was probably a sheet of metal or a tarp someone left out there, catching the light in a weird way, except there were no structures nearby, no equipment, nothing that would explain a curved shape rising and lowering itself like that. I kept driving, slower now, thinking maybe the angle had tricked me. As I climbed toward the ridge, I kept glancing to the right, expecting to see something. Debris, trash, maybe a weather balloon someone had dragged over the hill. But when I reached the top, the slope beyond was empty, just pale dirt and scattered brush. No tracks, no tire marks, not even disturbed sand. I pulled over anyway. The tanker hissed as it settled on its shocks. I stepped out, the heat still coming off the ground in waves. When I walked to the edge of the ridge and looked down, there was nothing that could have made the movement I saw. The slope was too gradual for anything heavy to hide behind. No rocks big enough to obscure a vehicle. And the rounded edge I'd seen, whatever it was, didn't match anything natural. I stayed there a while, listening. The desert made its usual noises. Dry wind across scrub, distant insects, the faint ticking of the truck's engine cooling, but nothing large moved, nothing shifted. I finally got back in and continued down to the checkpoint. The guards were their usual selves, polite but clipped. One of them, a guy named Harding, I'd talked to a few times, said I looked more jumpy than usual. I told him the ridge looked different today. He just nodded like he knew exactly what I meant. That bothered me more than if he'd laughed it off. On the way back, the sun had dipped enough to cast long shadows across the ridge. I watched the crest carefully, looking for any hint of movement. Nothing. The spot where the curved shape appeared was just a patch of dirt, like any other. I stopped again at the top of the ridge. There was no reason to. I wasn't required to inspect anything on return trips, but I felt like I had to look one more time. The breeze had picked up slightly. Dust shifted across the ground, but nothing larger moved. Then I noticed something faint near the base of the ridge, off to the side where the slope leveled out. A patch of ground that looked smoother than the surrounding dirt. Not newer, just cleaner, almost like it had been brushed flat. I climbed down the slope and crouched beside it. The soil felt compacted in a way the rest of the area didn't. Not like tire tracks, more uniform, compressed evenly. When I ran my hand across it, the texture felt strangely consistent, like the top layer had been pressed down all at once. There were no footprints, no marks, no signs an animal had been there. I stood up and listened again. Same desert sounds as before. Nothing unusual. Walking back to the truck, I felt that prickling sensation you get when someone's watching, even though I knew there was no one around for miles. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting the ridge to shift again. It never did. Back at the highway, I stopped for fuel. The attendant, an older guy named Morris, who'd lived in the area forever, asked if I'd had trouble on the dirt road. I hesitated, then said, "Thought I saw something big moving behind the ridge." He looked up from the pump screen. "Behind which ridge?" I pointed. He nodded once, slow. "That one's had some odd reports, usually from folks hauling in or out after hours." "What kind of reports?" He shrugged. "Shapes, movement, shadows, big ones. Nothing ever shows up when people go looking." That didn't help my nerves. I didn't tell him everything. The curved edge, the way it rose and sank, the untouched ground afterward. One thing I learned doing deliveries out there was not to overshare. People heard enough strange things already. For the next few runs, I avoided looking at the ridge too long. Not because I expected to see something, but because I wasn't sure what I'd do if I did. Every time I passed that spot, the cab felt a little too quiet. My radio would pick up static for a few seconds, then clear on its own. After a week of nothing happening, I convinced myself it had been heat distortion or a mirage. The desert plays tricks on you. Light bends, shadows move. Your mind fills gaps with familiar shapes. But I still slowed down at that same stretch every time, whether I meant to or not. About a month later, right near sunset, I saw something again. Not movement this time, just the ridgeline itself, shifting for a split second, like something massive ducked out of sight just before I came over the rise. Too fast to see details, too smooth to be natural. When I checked the slope afterward, it was empty, like always, and the ground below that spot looked freshly smooth again, pressed flat in that same strange, uniform way. I didn't stop after that. I drove the rest of the way without looking back, the road stretching out ahead of me like heat lifting off it even as the sun dropped. Whatever I'd seen, or thought I'd seen, it stayed behind that ridge, and I didn't plan on stopping there again. I heard the tapping about an hour into my shift. It was a cold night, dry desert cold, the kind that settles into your fingers even with gloves on. I was doing my usual walkthrough of the West Hangar, the one they only open for classified deliveries. Half the time it was pitch dark in there, except for the overhead safety lights that buzzed like dying insects. I'd done that route maybe 100 times before. Nothing ever happened. Most nights were just echoes, the hum of ventilation and my own boots on concrete. That night, though, I stepped past Storage Bay C and heard a faint tap, 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 tap coming from inside one of the sealed units. I stopped walking immediately. There was nothing in that section except transport crates, big steel ones with magnetic seals, no external access unless logged and authorized. I checked my clipboard. Unit C17, empty transport crate, checked in that morning. No outgoing movement. No assigned contents. The tapping came again, irregular this time, like someone lightly tapping a knuckle on the inside wall. I took a few slow steps toward it. The sound stopped instantly. The air felt colder right then, like the hangar ventilation kicked up even though it hadn't. I waited, listening. Nothing. I walked on, trying to convince myself it was the building settling. Metal expands and contracts, you hear things in a big, empty space. But the rhythm of it stayed with me. Not random, not clanging pipes. It had intention behind it. On my second pass, about 40 minutes later, the tapping started again. Same crate, same pattern of pauses, like someone thinking between taps. I turned my flashlight toward it and walked closer. The crate was unmarked except for the ID plate. The seal light was green, meaning locked. No dents, no shifting shadows, no visible movement. Just a big steel box sitting on its pallet like always. The tapping stopped just as I reached it. I stood there longer than I should have, waiting. The concrete under me felt slightly warmer than the rest of the floor, maybe my imagination, I don't know. I pressed my palm lightly to the side of the crate. It felt cool, the way steel should. But for a split second, I thought I felt something faint behind it. Not movement exactly, more like the vibration of a distant generator, except localized. When I pulled my hand away, the crate felt completely still. I finished the loop and went back to the guard station to check the internal logs. Nothing unusual. No recorded motion alarms, no sound-activated flags, no environmental alerts. The crate had been logged as empty on arrival, signed by a supervisor I barely knew. When I walked back out for the next patrol, I hesitated before turning left toward Bay C. Part of me wanted to skip it and avoid hearing anything else. But that wasn't an option, so I forced myself through the hangar doors again. Everything sounded normal at first. The lights buzzed overhead. The ventilation system gave that low, constant hum. My boots echoed sharply. Then the tapping returned. Fainter this time, almost timid, but definitely there. Tap, 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 tap. I approached slowly, not wanting to surprise whatever was happening, even though I didn't actually expect anything to react. When I got within maybe 8 feet, the sound stopped again. Cleanly, like someone flipping a mute switch. This time I circled the crate, checking each side with my flashlight. Nothing. No gaps. No signs of someone tampering with it. I leaned close to the seam where the top met the side panel. No air moving. No heat. No noise. When I stepped back, the overhead lights flickered, just a quick dim and return. The whole hangar does that sometimes, but the timing made my chest tighten a little. I decided to radio it in, but halfway to my shoulder mic, I stopped. What exactly would I report? Hey, Control, an empty crate is making tapping noises, but only when I'm not standing next to it. They'd send someone to check, find nothing, and I'd be the one who looked jumpy. I finished the patrol in silence. Around 3:45 a.m., on my final loop, I passed Bay C again. The crate sat exactly where it had been all night, no tapping, no flickering lights, nothing out of the ordinary. But as I walked past, the sound started up again, very quiet, barely noticeable. This time it was different. A single, soft tap every few seconds, almost like testing if I was still listening. I stopped walking, but didn't turn around. I listened with my back to the crate. The taps continued, slow, patient. I turned suddenly, taking a fast step toward the crate. Silence. I didn't move. I just stared at the steel box for a long time, waiting for something to happen. The overhead lights hummed. My breathing echoed inside my helmet. Nothing else. Eventually, I forced myself to finish the patrol. When my shift ended at 5, the replacement guard, Ortega, came in early. He noticed I seemed off and asked if anything strange had happened. I almost told him, but something held me back. Not fear, more like uncertainty. I didn't want to plant the idea in someone else's head if it was just a building noise, some structural quirk I happened to fixate on. Instead, I said, Bay C's been a little noisy, probably metal cooling. He nodded like that was completely normal. Maybe it was. Later that morning, after I'd signed out and was heading past the admin office, I overheard 2 maintenance guys talking quietly. One of them mentioned a crate being relocated from Bay C before sunrise. Said it wasn't scheduled, but someone higher up had ordered it moved to a storage tunnel. I don't know if they meant the same crate. They didn't specify a number, but the time lined up. When I came back for my shift that night, Bay C was nearly empty. The crate, C-17, was gone. The floor where it had been sitting was clean, like someone had scrubbed it. I checked the inventory system out of curiosity. The entry for C-17 was still there, but the location field was blank. No update, no outgoing check, just... I never heard the tapping again. But sometimes when I walked through the hangar on later shifts, I caught myself slowing near certain crates. Just listening, waiting for that faint sound to return, hoping and not hoping at the same time. Nothing ever tapped back. I first noticed the blind spot on a Wednesday night, sometime around 1:40 a.m. I was alone in the monitoring trailer on the east side of the compound, watching 3 satellite feeds on rotation. It was one of those shifts where nothing happens. The hum of the servers lulls you into a fog, and you start counting minutes instead of hours. The night outside was completely clear, no clouds, no wind, temperature stable. A perfect atmosphere for clean data. The feed from a SAT-12 glitched for exactly 1 second. Not a normal glitch either. It didn't pixelate or artifact. It didn't freeze. It just blacked out. Like something opaque passed between the satellite and the ground, covering the sensor's field in a smooth shadow. Then it snapped back to normal. I stared at the timestamp 01419 and rewound the buffer. The blackout happened again in playback. A perfect, full-frame darkness lasting barely longer than a blink. There were no storms in the region, no electromagnetic interference, no solar activity that would cause a full blackout this localized, and certainly nothing that should have lined up cleanly over the same coordinates, the center of the base. I marked it as a low-level anomaly and didn't mention it during the shift change briefing. Small glitches happen, but I took a screenshot anyway, saving it to my private notes folder. The same thing happened the next night. Different time, 2:3:44, but identical in every other way. A sudden moment of pure black like the camera shut its eyes. No distortion around the edges, no transition, no corruption. Just a single missing second of data. I flagged the event to my supervisor Hayes during the morning review. He skimmed the logs and said, could be signal drop or thermal drift. It's not drift, I said. It's too clean, too exact. Hayes pulled his coffee mug closer and shrugged. We'll keep an eye on it, which meant drop it. But I didn't. Over the next week, the blind spot appeared 3 more times, always at night, always centered directly over the base, and never lasting more than a couple seconds. There was no pattern to the timing, sometimes an hour apart, sometimes 2. But the blackout was always perfectly uniform, perfectly circular, and impossibly precise. I checked the satellite's orbital path. The blind spot didn't match any known shadow event, no eclipses, no earthshine, nothing. And the base itself didn't have any active obstructions tall enough or large enough to cause a blackout from that angle. On the 6th occurrence, I noticed something new. Right before the blackout, the brightness levels in the surrounding pixels dipped. Not by much, just fractions, but they dipped in a smooth radial gradient, as if light were bending around something. Then everything went dark for exactly 1.3 seconds. Then the feed returned to normal. No alarms were triggered. No automated systems flagged it. It was as if the equipment recognized the blackout as valid input. That bothered me more than anything else. One night, around 2:15 a.m., I went outside the trailer between rotations. The desert air was cold enough to sting my nose. The sky was a perfect dome of stars, bright, sharp, undisturbed. But when I glanced straight up, right above the base, something felt off. Not visibly. There was nothing to see, but there was a sense of a darker patch. Like the sky there didn't reflect starlight the same way. I tried focusing on it, but the harder I looked, the more my depth perception slipped, like my eyes couldn't lock onto the spot. A faint pressure built behind my ears, the same feeling I got during altitude chamber training years ago. When I stepped back under the trailer's fluorescent lights, the sensation faded instantly. I told myself I was overtired. 2 nights later, the blind spot appeared again, this time for 2 full seconds. Long enough that the system automatically created a quality control flag, long enough for the feed to drop to static for a half frame before going black entirely. When the image returned, the temperature readings for the ground had fluctuated slightly, even though real conditions hadn't changed. The calibration rebalanced itself within a minute, but the spike wasn't random. It preceded the blackout by exactly 0.05 seconds. Almost like the satellite was detecting something physically present, something with thermal characteristics unusual enough to distort the scan. I printed the frame and brought it to Hayes the next morning. He didn't even let me finish. Delete the logs. Why? Because there's nothing to investigate. It's a faulty sensor cluster. It's not faulty if the readings are controlled, I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. It's too consistent. It's happening over the same coordinates every time. Hayes looked at me, then at the printout. His expression tightened just for a moment before he slid the paper back toward me. Do not pursue this, he said. That was the first time he'd ever used that tone with me. That night, I checked the satellite diagnostics manually. Everything checked out. No drift, no thermal imbalance, no radiation interference. SAT-12 was running perfectly. At 1:58 a.m., the blind spot appeared again, but this time something else showed up, only for a frame, but enough for me to see it. A faint outline. Not a shape exactly, but a distortion, like the shadow of something curved. It moved slightly before vanishing into the black. I slammed the pause key, rewound, advanced frame by frame. The distortion didn't reappear. The playback was clean again, as if the system decided to overwrite the anomaly during buffer correction. But I had seen it. Something occupying space. Something high enough or large enough to block a satellite feed in a controlled perfect circle. The next morning, when I checked the logs, every record of the blind spots, every single one, had been purged. Not deleted. Purged. No metadata. No corrupted file notices. Just a seamless timeline with no gaps. My supervisor didn't mention it at all. I didn't bring it up. But since then, whenever I look up at a clear night sky, I find myself searching for that subtle absence. The faint place where the stars don't shine quite right, where something seems to be sitting between the sky and the ground. And sometimes, just for a moment, I feel that same pressure behind my ears, like the air is waiting for something to reappear. I first noticed the pattern during a routine swing shift. I wasn't looking for anything unusual. I was just doing what every junior operations officer does, keeping track of resource logs that no one else wanted to monitor. Power usage, water flow, HVAC loads, all the stuff that keeps a base running but never shows up in recruitment ads. It was late evening, a foggy night for the desert. The air stayed cool and heavy in a way that felt more coastal than Nevada. I remember wiping condensation off my truck's side mirror before heading into the admin building. The fog came in waves, rolling across the asphalt and then thinning out like it changed its mind. I was supposed to double-check power allocations for Hangar 4B, which normally housed atmospheric test equipment. Big, boring environmental rigs that were loud as hell and burned through electricity like crazy during calibration runs. But that night, the hangar was dark. Not dim. Dark. No ground crew, no technicians, no forklift in the loading bay. Even the security doors had their card readers set to restricted clear, a mode I'd only seen used during scheduled evacuations. The emptiness didn't bother me at first. Maintenance sometimes blocked out areas without warning. But when I pulled up the power logs, something was off. 4 hours earlier, around 1900, the hangar's energy draw had spiked to almost triple its usual peak. I scrolled back farther. The spike lasted exactly 37 minutes. Not around, not close to. Exactly. Then the log went flat, showing the hangar pulling almost no load at all, like everything inside had been shut down at once. I checked the day before. Same thing. The month before, again, same time window, same duration, same spike pattern. I leaned back in the chair, rubbing my forehead, trying to think of any scheduled procedure that hit that hard on the grid. Calibration didn't, power tests didn't, backup transitions didn't. Those usually produced messy, uneven spikes, not a perfect block of usage. I flagged it for review and left it at that, at least for the moment. But when I arrived on base the next night, there was talk, quiet stuff between crew chiefs and logistics guys, just vague comments about 4B being active again. One guy, Mendoza, mentioned picking up a faint metallic smell outside the hangar door hours after the place had supposedly shut down. He said it almost burned his throat. He laughed it off like it was just coolant, but coolant doesn't smell metallic, not the kind we use. Later that week, I walked past 4B during lunch. Everyone else was heading to the cafeteria, but the hangar had a thick red line of tape across the entryway, the kind used for internal lockdowns. The air felt cool near the door, even though it was a brutally hot afternoon, like there was a subtle draft coming from the seams around the frame. When I asked a tech supervisor, Cooper, what was going on, he kept his eyes on his tablet and said, "Scheduled purge," before walking off. That was the first time I felt like he was lying to me. A week passed. Then the next spike appeared in the logs. This time, I stayed late on purpose so I could check in real time. Around 1845, I drove toward the far end of the base where 4B sat by itself. Fog wasn't an issue anymore. The sky was clear, the moon bright enough to cast sharp shadows across the concrete. The hangar looked empty. Lights off, no one coming or going. At 1900 exactly, the ground vibrated. Not a quake, not heavy machinery, something more subtle like a subwoofer buried deep underground. The kind of vibration that makes the air feel thicker, like your ears want to pop but don't. I stopped walking. The vibration hummed under my boots and then steadied into a low, constant thrum. The lights inside the hangar snapped on all at once, bright enough to spill through the upper ventilation slats. But no silhouettes moved inside, not one. The power log on my tablet spiked in sync with the lights. I waited for trucks to arrive, for personnel to appear, for anything to indicate the hangar wasn't completely empty during a massive power draw. No one came. At one point, a golf cart passed on the road behind me, headlights sweeping across the pavement. The driver didn't look toward 4B at all. If anything, he kept his face pointed forward in a way that made me think he was intentionally ignoring it. Around minute 30 of the spike, the thrum under the ground shifted pitch slightly, like something changed gears. My chest felt tight, like the air pressure had increased by a small but noticeable amount. I backed up a few steps without meaning to. Then, at 37 minutes, almost to the second, everything stopped. The lights shut off. The vibration vanished. The pressure in the air eased. The hangar returned to looking abandoned. The spike in my log dropped to 0. I walked back to my truck, feeling uneasy but not scared yet. More like I'd stepped into something I shouldn't have. Some classified test procedure that junior officers weren't cleared to know about. But things got stranger after the next spike. I was reviewing footage from an exterior camera mounted near the fuel depot. Its angle caught a corner of 4B's roof. During another energy spike, this one around 22:15 because the schedule sometimes drifted, the camera image flickered. Not glitched. Flickered. For 3 frames, the roofline seemed to warp upward, like heat distortion but sharper, controlled. The timestamp on the footage jumped backward by exactly 1 second before continuing. I replayed it 10 times, trying to convince myself it was a camera malfunction. The next morning, that camera feed segment was missing. Not corrupted. Missing. The files jumped from 24059 to 26005. I asked the IT guy on duty what happened to the footage. He shrugged and said, probably overwritten. But that wasn't how the archive system worked, and he knew it. By then, I'd stopped mentioning anything to anyone. The next spike happened during a storm, not common out here, especially not the kind with rolling thunder and thick, low clouds. It was just after midnight when the rain started. I was driving across base to deliver a schedule update to night security when I saw faint flashes of light reflect off the wet pavement near 4B. Not lightning. Lightning is sharp and sudden. This was more like slow pulses, internal to the hangar. The fog from the storm had pooled around the building, making the lights inside look diffused, like something was glowing steadily behind the walls. The vibration started again, this time stronger. By the time I reached the security office, the windows were rattling slightly. I asked the sergeant inside if he felt it. He said, HVAC recalibration, without looking up from his clipboard. That was when fear actually settled in. Not because something huge was happening behind that hangar door, but because everyone who knew anything wouldn't acknowledge it. The next morning, reports for the night shift made no mention of weather interference. No notes about high power usage, nothing about the ground vibrations. It was like the entire event existed only in my logs and in my memory. After a few months of this, I tried one last thing. I drove out to the edge of the base at night on a day I knew the spike would occur. There's a small rise overlooking the compound from the public highway, far enough that no sensors would ping but close enough to see building silhouettes. At exactly the expected time, a soft glow formed around the roof of 4B. Not beams of light, just a pale halo like the concrete itself was backlit. The glow flickered once, steadying into a faint pulse that synced with the vibration in the air. Then it stopped. No vehicles came or left. No personnel appeared. When I returned to base the next day, 4B looked like it always did. Closed, quiet, unoccupied. And the month after that, my assignment was moved to a different wing. No explanation, no request, just a reassignment notice. I haven't checked the power logs since, but every time I drive past that hangar, especially on foggy evenings when the air feels thick and the ground seems to hum underfoot, I wonder what exactly needs so much power so consistently, while keeping everyone else away.